It always began with a cough, soft, polite, almost embarrassed, something no Victorian family wished to notice. Yet behind that single sound lay a terror more feared than cholera, more relentless than the slums themselves. Tuberculosis crept through Victorian Britain like a perfumed shadow, slipping beneath gas lamps and lace curtains, marking its victims with flushed cheeks and glistening eyes that looked almost cruelly alive. Doctors called it consumption, but the people whispered another name, the White Death. It moved with an elegance that mocked medicine. Parlours were aired out, linens boiled, prayers whispered into cold bedrooms where the air tasted faintly of iron and ether. And still, the sickness lingered, patient, silent, inevitable. It touched factory girls and aristocrats alike, ignoring class, ignoring comfort, leaving entire households sitting awake at night, listening for that next thin, dreadful breath. Imagine living in a world where one cough meant fate. If you're drawn to the forgotten epidemics that shaped history, don't forget to subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from, and stay close. Victorian Britain is about to reveal a killer it tried desperately to hide. The sound was so small at first that no one turned their head. It slipped through the drawing room like a misplaced note in an otherwise well-rehearsed symphony. A gentle cough, discreet and softened behind a gloved hand. Outside, the winter fog pressed against the windows, thick as wool and twice as heavy, muting the world beyond the glass. Inside, the lamps glowed low and amber, casting shadows that quivered along the patterned wallpaper. Yet, it was that single sound, barely louder than a breath, that unsettled the room more than the cold ever could. Miss Eleanor Harbury sat perfectly upright on the embroidered settee, her posture as precise as the porcelain figurines arranged behind her. She had coughed only once, and with great care, folding her handkerchief in a swift, practiced motion before anyone might glimpse what it held. Still, something in the gesture, too quick, too guarded, caused her mother's eyebrow to tighten, though she said nothing aloud. In Victorian households, illness was not discussed before guests. Illness was an intrusion, an impolite guest in itself. Yet the cough lingered even after it had quieted, echoing in the minds of those who had heard it. The Harbury drawing room, usually filled with polite chatter and the perfume of orange blossoms, seemed to thicken with a faint, new tension, almost imperceptible but undeniably present. Eleanor lifted her teacup, hoping the porcelain would steady her trembling fingers. But the cup clinked lightly against the saucer, a sound sharp enough to draw her own attention, if not others. She felt warm, too warm. A flush crept across her cheeks, rosy and bright, the kind mothers praised and suitors admired. But tonight it felt like something else, like heat gathering beneath her skin without permission. She willed it to fade, but the color remained stubbornly, blooming with a sickly radiance. She inhaled slowly, praying the air might cool her lungs. Instead, she felt only the familiar heaviness, as though the fog outside had seeped silently into her chest. In the far corner, her younger brother Henry watched with a solemnity unusual for a child. He had heard another cough like this once in the room of their late cousin Amelia the winter before she died. He said nothing now, though his hand curled tightly around the arm of his chair. Even children in Victorian England learned early to recognize omens adults tried desperately to ignore. Their mother rose at last, smoothing the skirts of her gown as though brushing away invisible dust. "The room is quite warm," she murmured. "I believe we should open the window a moment." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes flicked toward Eleanor with a fleeting, fearful glance. In that era, fresh air was whispered about, like a cure sent from heaven itself. If illness had crept inside their home, perhaps the night air, damp, cold, and smelling faintly of coal, might chase it out. A servant obeyed at once. The window creaked open, inviting a draught that coiled through the room like a ghost awakening. Candles fluttered, guests shivered. Eleanor placed a hand lightly against her throat, feeling the delicate bones beneath her skin. Her breath misted faintly in the chill, and she saw Henry watching that too. Another cough rose, this one deeper, almost pleading, and she suppressed it with such force that her eyes watered. Her mother's gloved hand froze mid-gesture. Conversation halted entirely. Even the fog outside seemed to lean closer to listen. Tuberculosis had other names, polite ones. Consumption, decline, the wasting sickness. But within families, it needed no title at all, only symptoms. A flush too bright, a breath too thin, a cough too soft, too persistent, too devastating. The lace curtains trembled in the draught as Eleanor drew her handkerchief once more to her lips. This time, she did not look inside it. She did not have to. The dread had already settled in the room, sweet and heavy as ether, telling its quiet truth. Something had begun. Dr. Alistair Pembroke arrived at the Harbury residence just as the lamps along Wellington Row flickered awake, their pale halos trembling in the evening fog. His carriage wheels whispered along the wet cobblestones, carrying with them the faint scent of disinfectant and camphor, a smell that clung to him the way soot clung to London's bricks. Neat, proper, and impeccably composed, he wore his usual soft leather gloves, the ones he favoured for house calls when families preferred comfort over the cold shine of surgical skill. In Victorian Britain, a doctor's manner mattered almost as much as his medicine. A footman ushered him into the vestibule where the warmth of the hearth met the chill of the night, forming a thin veil of mist that curled around his boots. Dr. Pembroke removed his hat, brushed a few droplets from its brim, and nodded with quiet gravity. He had been summoned with urgency, yet discretion an unmistakable sign. Illness was not to be spoken of loudly in homes of stature. Mrs. Harbury appeared at the top of the staircase, her face pale under the gaslight. She descended with grace, but her hands betrayed her fidgeting, twisting the edge of her handkerchief, tightening whenever the doctor approached. "She is in the drawing room," she whispered, as though louder words might worsen her daughter's condition. "She has been unwell since yesterday evening." Unwell, such a fragile word, so often a veil for something darker. Dr. Pembroke followed her into the drawing room, where Eleanor sat propped upon embroidered cushions, her posture straight but her shoulders faintly trembling. A golden lamp cast a soft halo around her, illuminating the subtle sheen of sweat along her brow and the unnatural brightness of her eyes. She greeted him with a small, brave smile, the kind patients offered when they already feared the worst. He approached with the deliberate stillness of a man trained to cause no alarm. "Miss Harbury," he murmured, slipping off a glove to feel her pulse. Her skin was warm, too warm, and beneath the delicate beat of her heart throbbed something heavier, something he had felt countless times before. Her breath came shallowly, each inhalation strained as though she were pulling air through cotton. A cough rose. She tried to stifle it. Failed. Dr. Pembroke reached for his leather bag. When he withdrew his stethoscope, gleaming faintly in the lamplight, Mrs. Harbury's eyes darted toward it with barely contained dread. That instrument, introduced only decades earlier, carried a reputation both hopeful and ominous. To place it against one's chest was to invite truth. "Breathe deeply, if you please," he said. Eleanor obeyed. The sound that answered him was not the healthy rush of air, but a muted crackling, faint yet unmistakable, like paper stiffening after a spill. A sound he had heard in too many parlours, too many tenements, too many lives that had withered before their time. He lifted the stethoscope from her chest with careful restraint, schooling his expression into neutrality. Doctors in this era learned early to walk the line between honesty and mercy. "Is it serious?" Eleanor asked, her voice a soft tremor. He hesitated. Only a moment, but enough for her to understand. Mrs. Harbury clutched the back of a chair. Dr. Pembroke donned his soft gloves again, a ritual that felt almost like armor. "You must rest," he said gently. "Fresh air, moderate activity, a tonic perhaps. I will prepare something to ease your breathing." the familiar prescriptions, the familiar helplessness. For he knew, though he did not yet speak it, that if tuberculosis had settled into Eleanor's lungs, no tonic, no fresh air, no whispered prayer would drive it out. As he packed his instruments, a draught crept through the room, fluttering the fringe of the lace curtains. Eleanor's cough echoed once more, fragile as glass. Dr. Pembroke paused at the doorway. "Doctor," Mrs. Harbury whispered, her voice breaking at the edges, "you must tell me, is my daughter in danger?" His reply was barely audible. "I fear the illness may be of a serious nature. Not the truth in full, but enough." When he stepped back into the night, the fog swallowed him almost instantly. The street lamps blurred into halos, and the city exhaled a long, cold breath that seemed to drift straight from the Harbury drawing room. Behind him, in the house now heavy with dread, Eleanor coughed again, and Dr. Pembroke knew that the sound would haunt the family long after he returned tomorrow, and the day after that, until the truth could no longer be softened by gloves, or tonics, or gentle lies. In the mornings that followed Dr. Pembroke's visit, the Harbury household moved with a hushed, reverent quiet, as though every footstep might unsettle the fragile air Eleanor breathed. Servants padded softly through the corridors. Doors were eased shut instead of closed. Even the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to tick with unusual restraint. Yet nothing could disguise the truth blooming across Eleanor's cheeks, a delicate flush, rosy and bright, like the glow of a fading ember. To a casual observer, Eleanor might have appeared healthier than ever. Victorian society adored such colour, praising it as a sign of youth, vivacity, and good breeding. Gentlemen at evening functions spoke fondly of the fashionable pallor, a fair complexion warmed by a sudden blush. But within her home, the Harburys recognized the brilliance for what it truly was, an omen. The flush did not fade. If anything, it deepened. One crisp morning, when frost clung to the iron railings outside and mist swirled like pale smoke along Wellington Row, Eleanor insisted on joining her mother for tea in the morning room. Mrs. Harbury agreed only after much persuasion, though she hovered anxiously as Eleanor crossed the room, each step slightly slower than the last. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, illuminating particles of dust suspended in the still air. Eleanor moved into the light, and the brightness across her cheeks seemed almost ethereal, too radiant, too fixed, too unnatural. Mrs. Harbury felt her breath falter. It was the very look she remembered from her sister Clara's final winter, the deceptive bloom that had faded only when breath had stopped altogether. "Are you cold, my dear?" she asked, noticing Eleanor's hands trembling as she reached for her teacup. "No, only tired." Eleanor managed a soft smile, though her lips were pale in contrast to her cheeks. "I slept well enough." But she had not slept well. The night had been restless, each breath shallow, each cough muffled against pillows so her mother would not wake. A thin sheen of perspiration had lain across her skin, despite the chill in the room. She had clutched at the quilts for warmth, then pushed them away in sudden feverish discomfort. Morning brought no relief, only the steady, burning flush upon her face. As they sipped their tea, Henry crept into the room, his small hands wrapped around a wooden toy soldier. He paused upon seeing Eleanor. The colour in her cheeks fascinated him and frightened him in equal measure. Children, though rarely allowed to speak of illness, sensed its presence instinctively. "Ellie," he whispered, "you look like you've been running." She laughed softly, but the sound dissolved into a cough, sharp, jarring, echoing faintly against the porcelain teacups. Mrs. Harbury's teacup rattled against its saucer. Henry's eyes widened. Eleanor pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. When she lowered it, she kept it folded tightly, but a faint, rust-coloured stain marked the cloth. She hid it quickly in the folds of her gown, hoping her mother hadn't noticed. But a mother always notices. Always. The room felt suddenly colder. The sunlight, once warm and gentle, now cast long, accusing shadows across the rug. "Perhaps we should return you to bed," Mrs. Harbury said, her voice trembling despite her best effort to remain composed. Eleanor shook her head. "I want to stay, just for a little while." Her mother hesitated, then gave a stiff, wordless nod. Permission felt like surrender. Outside, a carriage rattled down the street, its wheels grinding against frost. Inside, Eleanor drew a deeper breath than before, and the sound carried a faint, wheezing undertone, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to anyone who had waited through sleepless nights beside a failing loved one. Mrs. Harbury rose from her chair. "Eleanor," she murmured, "let me fetch Dr. Pembroke again." But Eleanor reached for her mother's hand with surprising strength. "No," she said quietly. "Not yet." Her cheeks, still flushed with that eerie, dangerous brightness, glowed like the last embers of a dying fire. Mrs. Harbury felt something collapse inside her, a truth forming in the silence between breaths. The blush that Victorian society admired had become a warning, a cruel, shimmering mask beneath which something unseen and merciless had begun to take hold. And in the warm morning light, Eleanor's radiance felt less like beauty and more like the beginning of an ending no one dared speak aloud. The handkerchief had always been an accessory of elegance in the Harbury household, embroidered silk for evenings, fine lawn cotton for daytime calls, each one pressed to perfection by the maid before being tucked into pockets and sleeves. But in recent days, the handkerchief had become something else entirely, a sentinel, a secret keeper, a thin square of fabric that held more truth than any polite conversation dared to express. Eleanor had begun carrying hers constantly, always folded, always within reach, always handled with the kind of desperate discretion found only in those who fear what they might reveal. On a dim, frost-soaked afternoon, she sat near the drawing-room fire, wrapped in a shawl far too heavy for her usual taste. The flames crackled softly, casting ribbons of gold across the carpet, but the warmth did little to ease her shivering. Her mother hovered nearby, pretending to mend a hem as she watched Eleanor from the corner of her eye. When the cough came, it was sudden, sharp, violent, tearing. Eleanor bent forward slightly, the movement frail and desperate. She pressed the handkerchief tightly to her lips, her eyes pinched shut, the sound muffled into a trembling gasp. "Eleanor?" Mrs. Harbury whispered. Eleanor nodded, keeping her face turned away. She coughed again, softer this time, then steadied herself against the arm of the chair. When the fit ended, she folded the handkerchief once, twice too quickly, too expertly. The gesture was not the absent-minded tidying of a proper lady. It was the instinctive concealment of someone trying to hide the dark bloom of disease. Her mother's sewing needle froze mid-stitch. "May I see it?" she asked softly. Eleanor's fingers curled protectively around the cloth. "It's nothing, Mamma. Just a touch of the cold. The fog." But Mrs. Harbury was already rising. She approached slowly, like someone approaching a wounded creature. Her hand hovered above Eleanor's for a long, tense moment before her daughter surrendered the handkerchief with a trembling breath. The stain at its center was unmistakable. A dull, rusty red, small but undeniable. Mrs. Harbury's breath left her in a quiet, strangled whisper. Her eyes closed as though shielding herself from the sight. Blood. Not from a cut, not from a winter nosebleed, but from the lungs, the place where tuberculosis left its early signatures, delicate yet deadly. Eleanor reached out, gently touching her mother's wrist. "Please, don't look at me like that." Mrs. Harbury sank into the chair beside her. The handkerchief rested in her lap, a silent verdict, its crimson mark bright against the white linen. "I hoped, I prayed it would not come to this," she said, her voice thin and wavering. Eleanor tried to smile, but her lips trembled too much. It might still be nothing. But they both knew the truth. A mother always does. The fire crackled weakly, as if shrinking from the moment. Outside, the fog pressed heavier against the windows, frosting the edges like cold breath on glass. The house felt smaller, quieter, as though it, too, had sensed the shift. Mrs. Harbury folded the stained handkerchief very slowly now, her fingers lingering on the fabric. "We must call Dr. Pembroke again." Eleanor shook her head, her voice suddenly fragile. What can he do that he has not already done? Her mother didn't answer. She couldn't. For as she held the handkerchief, its stain blooming like an omen, she understood that calling the doctor was not to seek a cure, but to confirm a fear that had slipped quietly into their lives the night Eleanor first suppressed a cough behind lace curtains, a fear now visible in the crimson threads of a folded handkerchief. And with that single mark, the household crossed the threshold from worry into dread, from hope into the slow, suffocating realization. The White Death had entered their home. The winter fog had thinned by morning, but the cold lingered with a tenacity that crept beneath doors and settled in the bones of the Harbury house. Yet despite the chill, Eleanor's bedroom window lay open, propped carefully with a brass latch, so the air could flow freely, as ordered by Dr. Pembroke. Fresh air, he insisted, was vital. Let the lungs breathe. Let the sickness weaken in the presence of purity. But the breeze that wandered in carried no purity. It was heavy with coal smoke from neighbouring chimneys, damp with river mist, and sharp with the metallic tang of London winter. Still, the window remained ajar as if it were a sentinel guarding against an invisible foe. Eleanor sat propped among pillows, the soft wool blanket drawn to her chin. Her breath fogged faintly in the cold air, a fragile puff that vanished almost as soon as it formed. The room around her, usually warm with embroidered drapes, and the faint scent of lavender, felt transformed. Sterile, quiet, expectant, as though waiting for verdicts no one dared voice. Her mother stood near the window, staring out at the pale morning light seeping through the fog. Her hands gripped the sill, knuckles pale beneath her gloves. She watched the street below, carriages rolling by, children hurrying to school, milk carts rattling along the cobblestones, life continuing with careless indifference. Behind her, the faint rhythm of Eleanor's breathing frayed her composure more with each passing moment. "You should come away from the window, Mama," Eleanor murmured. Her voice, once light and musical, now carried a tremor that made the air around it grow still. Mrs. Harbury turned. Her eyes, rimmed with sleeplessness, softened. "The doctor says the room must have air." She tried to smile, but it faltered midway. "He believes it will help." Eleanor did not contradict her, but she remembered the doctor's expression, the way he hesitated before agreeing to the regimen. The way he looked at her, not with optimism, but with pity carefully concealed behind professional courtesy. Her cough began again, quiet at first, then deeper, rattling her chest like fragile porcelain in an unsteady hand. She bent forward slightly, gripping the blanket, her face tightening with pain. When it subsided, she sank back. Her skin drained of all colour save the stubborn flush upon her cheeks. Mrs. Harbury rushed to her side. "Enough of this cold air." She moved to close the window, but Eleanor's hand, weak yet determined, caught her sleeve. "No," Eleanor whispered. "Leave it open. It eases me just a little. But the draft is kinder than the tightness in my chest," Eleanor said, her gaze drifting toward the pale square of sky. "Let the air stay." Her mother froze, torn between instinct and instruction. Finally, she stepped back, conceding to her daughter's quiet plea. The room filled again with the faint moan of winter wind. Curtains swayed like ghosts at the edges of Eleanor's vision. A robin perched briefly on the windowsill, feathers puffed against the cold, before flitting away with a small, startled chirp. "How strange," Eleanor murmured. "On a day like this, the world seems both alive and very far from reach." Mrs. Harbury sat beside her, smoothing a stray strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "You will improve," she said softly. "You must." Eleanor closed her eyes. "I will try." From the hallway came the distant sound of Henry's footsteps, hurried and light. He paused outside the door, listening, uncertain, before retreating quietly. Even he understood now that joy had grown fragile in this house, easily shattered by the weight of a single cough. The open window, meant as a promise of clean air and recovery, had become a threshold between hope and helplessness. Each breath Eleanor pulled in from the cold morning air felt simultaneously like relief and surrender, and as the curtains billowed inward, carrying the faint scent of chimney smoke and frost, it seemed the room itself inhaled with her slowly, carefully, bracing for the long winter that had taken root in her lungs. The apothecary on Wellington Row stood like a dimly glowing lantern amid the fog. Its windows, clouded by age and dusted with the residue of countless mixtures, revealed little of the world inside. Only the flicker of a single lamp behind the counter could be seen from the street, an amber heartbeat in the gloom. Families whispered of cures within those walls, though anyone who had lost a loved one knew better. The apothecary offered hope, not miracles. On a particularly bitter evening, when the fog curled low across the pavement like a living thing, Mrs. Harbury pushed open the door with trembling resolve. A bell above her head chimed faintly, swallowed almost instantly by the thick air. The shop smelled of herbs, alcohol, and something chalky that clung to the lungs. Glass bottles lined the shelves, some marked boldly, others faded into anonymity, each one filled with the promises of Victorian medicine. Mr. Arkwright, the apothecary himself, emerged from behind a curtain. His spectacles were smudged, his waistcoat dusted with powders, and his expression wore the tired calm of a man who had long ago learned how to navigate grief without absorbing it. "Mrs. Harbury," he said with a grave nod, recognizing her at once. "The doctor sent word." She clutched her gloves tightly. "He said you would prepare something for my daughter. Something strengthening." Arkwright gestured for her to follow him to the counter. "A formulation of my own design," he murmured, selecting small jars with practiced hands. Gentle on the lungs, soothing to the nerves. He reached for a tin marked pulvis albus, a fine, chalk-white powder. As he removed the lid, a faint puff rose into the air, shimmering briefly in the lamplight. Chalk-white, delicate, deceptively pure. Mrs. Harbury watched each movement with desperate eyes. Will it help? Truly help? Arkwright paused, spoon poised above the scale. The silence hung between them like a veil. "It may bring her comfort," he said finally. "Less coughing, more ease in breath, if only for a time." He did not finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Victorian mothers understood the language of omission more fluently than any spoken assurance. He continued blending powders, white, pale amber, soft grey, each added with the precision of a ritual. The air in the shop seemed to thicken with anticipation, as though the walls themselves knew this mixture would soon be carried into a sick room where hope had grown frail. Once complete, Arkwright poured the powder into a small glass bottle, sealing it with a cork and tying a paper label with twine. To be taken with warm milk, it read in delicate ink, 1 teaspoon at dusk. Mrs. Harbury held the bottle as though it contained her daughter's life. The chalky substance shifted gently inside, whispering against the glass like drifting snow. "Administer sparingly," Arkwright instructed. "Too much may weaken her further, but too little may leave the night cruel." Her throat tightened. "Thank you." Outside, the fog wrapped around her like mourning cloth as she stepped onto the street. The bottle was cold in her pocket, clinking softly with her hurried steps. Every shadow in the gas-lit gloom seemed to sharpen her fear. When she returned home, Eleanor lay half asleep, her breaths shallow, her face gleaming with fever's unnatural beauty. Mrs. Harbury set the bottle on the bedside table, its pale contents glowing faintly in the lamplight. "Is that the medicine?" Eleanor whispered, her voice thin. "Yes, darling." Her mother measured a small spoonful, stirring it into warm milk until it dissolved. transforming the liquid into a soft, opalescent haze. Eleanor drank it slowly, each sip easing the tension in her throat. For a brief moment, her breathing softened. The lines of pain on her face loosened. She drifted towards sleep with a fragile peace. But as Mrs. Harbury watched her daughter rest, her eyes returned to the chalky residue at the bottom of the glass. It seemed almost luminous, a reminder that the apothecary's greatest gift was not a cure, but comfort disguised as hope. And as the night deepened around them, the bottle of chalk-white powder stood on the table like a quiet sentinel, guarding a truth Victorian families knew all too well. Sometimes medicine soothed the body, but only prayers, desperate, whispered. Trembling prayers lifted the weight of fear. The workhouse on Millbank stood like a stone sentinel against the grey sky, its walls cold, unyielding, and stained by decades of soot. Even in daylight it seemed dim, for the sun rarely reached the narrow windows cut high above the ground. Inside, the air bore the mingled scent of damp wool, thin gruel, and unwashed bodies, a place where poverty gathered, not in quiet corners, but in every breath. It was here that illness moved most freely. On a bleak morning, when frost clung like lace to the iron gates, the first sound that broke the stagnant silence was not the overseer's call or the clang of tin bowls, but a cough, thin, sharp, and startling in its clarity. It echoed along the stone corridors, bouncing from one cold wall to the next. No one looked up at first. Coughing was common. Hunger coughed. The cold coughed. Life itself coughed within these walls. But then came another, and another. In the women's ward, where thin blankets covered thinner bodies, a girl of no more than 14 sat upright on her cot, her eyes wide with fear as she pressed a rag to her mouth. Her skin glowed with fever, and her hair clung damply to her temples. She tried to suppress the sound, but it fought its way out again, this time deeper, more violent, hollow as though echoing from within a cavern. Beside her, an elderly woman shifted uneasily. "Not another one," she whispered, her voice raspy as paper. "Not again." Across the room, a matron strode briskly between rows of beds, her boots clicking against the cracked stone floor. She carried an air of exhaustion paired with sternness, though beneath her rigid posture lay a heart long frayed by sorrow. When she heard the cough, she stopped mid-step. "Mary?" she called softly. The girl looked up, her eyes glistening. She lowered the rag. The matron's breath caught. The cloth was spotted with rust-colored stains, not fresh, not bright, but undeniable. Old blood mingled with the new. She had seen it too many times. "Get up slowly," the matron instructed, her voice gentle despite herself. "You must come with me." Mary tried to rise, but her legs quivered beneath her. The older woman steadied her, guiding her toward the infirmary at the far end of the ward. As they passed the other beds, the room fell into a tense hush. Every woman and girl watched with the same fearful understanding. Tuberculosis had found them again. Within the infirmary, a narrow cot waited beneath a draughty window. The matron eased Mary onto it, pulling a thin blanket over her trembling frame. A physician would arrive later, if he had time. Often he didn't. Too few doctors served too many souls whose lives blurred into the same quiet suffering. Another cough escaped Mary's lips, this one accompanied by a soft wheeze. Her body curled inward with the effort. The matron sat beside her, folding the stained rag into her apron. "Rest now," she said, though she knew rest would bring only temporary mercy. Outside, the corridor filled with whispers. The overseer muttered about separating the sick, about the cost of more coal for the infirmary fire, about how illness spread faster in cold weather. But his concerns were practical, not compassionate. The workhouse existed not to comfort, but to contain. By midday, whispers had turned to murmurs of dread. The coughing spread first to a young mother holding her infant. then to an elderly man sweeping the floor, then to a boy no older than Henry Harbury, who had been sweeping cinders near the furnace. Each cough carried the faint rattle of something sinister blooming within. The sound travelled through the building like a warning bell that no one wished to acknowledge. Tuberculosis had entered the workhouse with silent steps, needing no invitation. And as the afternoon shadows lengthened and the temperature fell, the cough repeated again in the women's ward, then in the men's, then in the children's, echoing with haunting clarity through the stone maze of the poor. Illness had made itself at home, and the workhouse, with all its cold walls and strict rules, could do nothing but listen. Miss Abigail Whitcomb had always carried herself with the graceful composure expected of a Victorian governess, neither too bold nor too meek, always poised, always proper. She arrived at the Harbury residence punctually each morning, her figure slender and upright, her expression calm, even when the children misbehaved or the lessons ran long. Yet as winter pressed deeper into the city, something in her appearance began to shift subtly at first, then unmistakably. Her cheeks, once softly rounded, hollowed beneath her eyes. The fabric of her modest grey dress hung looser around her waist. Her steps, formerly brisk and assured, grew lighter, as if she were walking through fog so thick it held her back. But she dismissed any inquiries with polite smiles, too polite, too practiced. "Just the season," she would say. "Cold weather never agrees with me." But the truth settled into her figure like frost on glass. On one dull morning, when the sky sagged low with clouds that refused to break, Miss Whitcomb began her lessons at the small wooden desk in the children's study. Henry Harbury recited arithmetic while she corrected his posture softly, but her hand trembled when she reached for the chalk. She steadied herself quickly, hoping no one noticed. But children, perceptive in ways adults forget to be, noticed everything. "Miss Whitcomb," Henry whispered, "are you unwell?" She forced a smile. "Only tired, dear. Continue your sums." Yet even as she spoke, a faint flush crept across her cheeks, too bright, too sudden. She drew a quiet breath, but the air caught in her chest, snagging like thread on a splinter. A cough escaped, delicate at first, then sharper. She pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips and leaned away from the boy, her shoulders quivering. Henry froze, remembering the sound from his sister. The governess composed herself with visible effort. "Forgive me," she murmured. "The dust in this room is dreadful today." But Henry saw the pinkish stain blooming faintly through the handkerchief as she folded it. Later that day, when she descended the staircase to depart, Mrs. Harbury intercepted her in the foyer. She had noticed the waning figure, the cough too similar to Eleanor's, and the haunted look Miss Whitcomb carried like a shadow. "My dear Miss Whitcomb," she began gently, "you seem unwell. Perhaps you should take leave for a few days." The governess stiffened, her composure cracking like thin ice. She drew her shawl tighter around her shrinking frame. "I assure you, madam, I am quite capable of attending to the children. But you are pale, and your breath—" "It is nothing," Miss Whitcomb interjected quickly. Too quickly. "Work will do me good. It always has." Her eyes flickered downward, and in that small movement, Mrs. Harbury glimpsed a truth, unspoken but deeply known. Governesses did not fall ill. Not openly, not visibly. Illness jeopardized employment, and employment was the fragile bridge between survival and destitution. "You must rest," Mrs. Harbury urged, voice softening. "We can continue to pay your salary while you recover." For the first time, Miss Whitcomb's composure truly faltered. She shook her head with a fragile fierceness. "Please, madam, I have no family to tend to me, no other income. If I stop working—" Her voice broke. She turned away before the emotion could fully surface. Mrs. Harbury felt a coldness spread through her chest, one unrelated to the draft slipping beneath the door. How many women like Miss Whitcomb softened into silence because the world offered them no place to collapse? How many worked themselves thin not from ambition, but from terror? That evening, the governess walked home alone through the fog, her figure barely a silhouette under the gas lamps. Her cough echoed faintly as she paused to steady herself against a wrought-iron fence. The winter wind stabbed through her shawl, but she kept walking, shoulders hunched, breath trembling. Behind her, the Harbury household dimmed its lamps for the night. Ahead of her, the fog swallowed her path. And in the quiet, heavy air, one truth clung to her with chilling certainty. There were illnesses a refined Victorian woman could hide in plain sight. But consumption, once it began its slow erasure, revealed itself in every diminishing step. Every morning before the fog had fully lifted from Wellington Row, a milk cart creaked through the streets, its wheels carving soft grooves into the damp cobblestones. The milkman, bundled in a fraying coat, moved from doorstep to doorstep with practiced efficiency, leaving behind glistening bottles capped in tin. Victorians trusted milk the way they trusted bread or water, simple nourishment, gentle enough for the sick, strengthening for the frail. But this winter, the Harbury household had begun to regard milk with quieter eyes. It started subtly. Eleanor, weakened by nights of restless breathing, found solace in warm milk, stirred with the apothecary's chalk-white powder. For a brief moment after drinking it, her face relaxed, her lungs loosened, her trembling eased. But as the days passed, something shifted. Her cough grew heavier, deeper, like a weight dragging at her chest. One morning, the cook, Mrs. Bingham, brought a tray upstairs. The milk in the porcelain cup steamed gently, curling tendrils of warmth into the cold air of Eleanor's room. But when she handed it to the girl, Eleanor hesitated. "The smell," she whispered. Mrs. Bingham sniffed the cup, brow furrowing. It held the same faint sweetness as always, but beneath it lurked a sourness so mild it was almost imagined, almost. "I'll fetch another," the cook said quickly, withdrawing the cup. But Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling. "No, no, I'll drink it. I need something warm." She lifted the cup to her lips, took a careful sip, and winced. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mrs. Bingham poured the remaining milk into the sink with a troubled sigh. It coated the basin in a thin film, thicker than water, lighter than cream. Something about the way it clung disturbed her. More disturbing still was the memory from her cousin, in the countryside, farms overrun, cattle falling ill, milk turning dangerous. She had dismissed the tale as rural gossip, until now. Just after noon, Dr. Pembroke arrived for his daily visit. He found Mrs. Bingham waiting near the entryway, wringing her apron between her hands. "Doctor," she whispered, glancing up the staircase to ensure no one overheard, "I fear the milk. I fear it may not be safe." Dr. Pembroke paused, the furrow in his brow deepening. "Explain." She told him of the sour scent, the thickened texture, the farmer's new illness in the outskirts reported by other servants. He listened, his expression cooling into something grim. Tuberculosis did not belong only to humans. Cattle, too, could harbour the White Death, passing it quietly into the milk that found its way into countless Victorian homes. "Throw out the entire lot," he instructed gently, "and secure milk from a safer source, if such a thing can still be found in winter." Mrs. Bingham nodded vigorously and hurried away. Upstairs, Eleanor coughed a hollow, wrenching sound that scraped the very air. Dr. Pembroke's face softened with sorrow before he entered her room. She lay propped against her pillows, pale and exhausted, but she managed a faint smile when he approached. "The milk did help me sleep," she murmured. His heart tightened. There were truths too cruel to place upon the shoulders of someone already suffering. Instead, he examined her carefully. Her fever had climbed, her breathing rasped. A faint crackle whispered through her lungs with every inhalation. "Doctor," she said quietly, "am I worse today?" He hesitated. The window behind her stood ajar, letting in a thin stream of cold air that stirred the lace curtains like restless spirits. Her cheeks, bright with fever, made the rest of her look ghost-like by contrast. "You must rest," he replied softly, "and we will try fresh broth instead of milk for now." She nodded, too tired to question it. When he left the room, Mrs. Harbury intercepted him in the hallway. Her eyes searched his face, hungry for reassurance, terrified of the truth. "Is it progressing?" He lowered his voice. "I fear so. We must be cautious. Infection may have come from more than the air." A single tear escaped down her cheek. Below, in the kitchen, Mrs. Bingham scrubbed the sink with trembling hands, watching the last traces of milk swirl away down the drain. Comfort, she thought bitterly, was not always harmless. And, in a city as vast and as vulnerable as Victorian London, even nourishment could carry death in its quiet, unsuspecting currents. By late winter, the city had begun to change in ways too subtle for official notice, yet too ominous for ordinary Londoners to ignore. It began with whispered hesitations in drawing rooms, the sudden hush in theatres when an unexpected cough rang out, the wary glances exchanged between strangers on an omnibus. Consumption had always lingered in the poorer districts, haunting workhouses and tenements like a pale spectre. But now it crept across social boundaries with cold, delicate fingers, and London, vast and pulsing with life, seemed to tighten in fear. Fog rolled in heavier that season, pooling in the streets like a second skin. It pressed against windows, seeped into hallways, and dulled the edges of the gas lamps until the glow felt weaker, as though the very light had begun to tire. People said the air itself felt wrong, thicker, tainted, weighted with something unseen. Housewives wiped condensation from panes, only to find the glass clouding again, as though the city were exhaling steadily, endlessly, without drawing in a full breath. In the Harbury home, the servants worked quietly under a veil of dread. Eleanor's illness had become the unspoken anchor around which every decision curved. Footfalls softened, voices lowered. No one lingered in corridors, for fear the sound of her coughing might drift out like a cry to be answered. Even Henry, normally lively and irrepressible, moved about the house like a child grown suddenly older. Beyond their home, the signs of sickness multiplied. Men stood outside apothecaries clutching brown paper packets of powders. Women carried bottles of thick elixirs wrapped tightly against the cold. Children wore mufflers pulled high around their faces, though it did little to shield them from the breath of the city. Street vendors hawked lung restoratives and sputum cures beside roasted chestnuts and newspapers, their confident tones battling the underlying fear listeners pretended not to feel. On one particularly dim morning, Dr. Pembroke made his rounds through the borough. As he crossed Westminster Bridge, he noticed how eerily still the river appeared, its surface smooth, reflecting the pale sky in muted silver. A woman walking ahead of him stopped suddenly, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. When she withdrew it, a single red spot glared back at her. She folded it quickly, glancing around to ensure no one had seen. He had seen. He saw it everywhere now. The city, it seemed, was bleeding in tiny, secret ways. In crowded tenements, entire families coughed through the night, their sounds blending with the distant rumble of carts. Neighborhoods that once rang with street cries now hummed with subdued anxiety. And in the wealthier districts, where polished brass knockers gleamed on proud doors, households whispered about governesses falling ill, dinner guests excusing themselves early, and parlours airing out in the middle of winter to stave off a creeping dread. Londoners began avoiding each other's eyes. The simple act of sharing air felt suddenly intimate, perilous. Even the newspapers, usually bold with headlines, grew cautious. They printed polite reminders: avoid exertion, take the open air, seek medical advice if coughs persist. The words felt antiseptic compared to the truth lurking beneath them. At the Harbury residence, Eleanor's window remained cracked open, the cold drifting in around her like a shroud. Some days she was lucid, Others, she drifted between fevered dreams and painful awakenings. Her mother sat beside her, hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the uneven pattern of her daughter's breathing. "Is the whole world ill, Mama?" Eleanor asked weakly one afternoon, gazing at the pale sky beyond the window. Mrs. Harbury swallowed. "No, darling, only some." But the lie tasted brittle, dissolving on her tongue like ash. Because London was ill not with fever or plague, but with fear. An entire city holding its breath, waiting for the sound of one cough too many. And in that suspended hush, life continued not quite as before, not yet transformed, but caught in a fragile, uncertain space, where the next breath felt as precious as it was precarious. A city can survive fire, flood, or storm, but when breath itself becomes suspect, when the quiet inhale of another feels dangerous, London, for the first time in many years, felt mortal. It was one of the cruel ironies of Victorian society that illness, in its earliest and most delicate stages, could be mistaken for beauty. As winter deepened and Londoners whispered of the White Death weaving through their streets, the upper classes clung fervently, almost desperately, to the aesthetics of refinement. Pale skin was elegance, slimness was discipline, a faint blush was charm, and so the symptoms that should have raised alarm were instead praised in parlours lit by amber lamps. They called it the ethereal look, the consumptive glow term spoken with admiration rather than dread. Fashion plates in ladies' magazines depicted young women with narrow shoulders, luminous eyes, and cheeks touched with just a hint of fevered pink. Mothers wished such radiance for their daughters, unaware or unwilling to admit that the ideal they prized was borrowed from the visage of the dying. Mrs. Harbury saw the contradiction everywhere. At a tea gathering she reluctantly attended, guests remarked upon Eleanor's beauty in absentia. "Her complexion must be exquisite," one lady murmured, unaware of the agony behind it. That delicate warmth, a sign of refinement. Mrs. Harbury's teacup nearly slipped from her hands. Refinement. If they only knew the cost of that glow. Across the room, another guest lamented her own daughter's robust health. "Too much colour," she sighed. "So difficult to keep her looking dainty." The room rippled with sympathetic nods. How strange, Mrs. Harbury thought, that society romanticized the very pallor that kept her awake at night, listening for the next ragged breath from Eleanor's room. She excused herself early, unable to bear the contradictions any longer. Meanwhile, in the Harbury home, Eleanor's appearance shifted with agonizing subtlety. Her waist, once gently curved, grew slender to the point of fragility. Her eyes, those clear, thoughtful eyes, seemed to widen as the flesh around them hollowed. The faint blush that had lingered on her cheeks now appeared more frequently, blooming with a feverish glow that the world might misinterpret as youthful vibrancy. When her reflection caught her by surprise in the dressing mirror, she paused, startled by her own image. "I look altered," she whispered to her maid Clara. Clara hesitated, torn between comfort and honesty. "You look lovely, miss," she said softly. "Just tired, perhaps." But Eleanor was not deceived. She watched the way Clara's gaze lingered too long on her protruding collarbones, how her hands tightened around the comb as if steadying herself. Beauty was not supposed to feel painful. It was not supposed to steal breath from the lungs or strength from the limbs. One afternoon, a dressmaker arrived with alterations. Eleanor's gowns, though once tailored perfectly, now draped loosely about her frame. As the woman measured her new proportions, she raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Silence, in this era, was often kinder than truth. "You must be pleased," the dressmaker said gently. "Ladies long for this delicate shape." Eleanor glanced toward her open window, where cold wind stirred the curtains. "I do not long for it," she replied quietly. "I long only to breathe without effort." That evening, Henry approached her bedside with a drawing he had made a portrait of his sister before illness touched her. Her face in the picture was rounder, her smile brighter. "You looked like this," he said proudly. Eleanor touched the paper with trembling fingers. "Yes," she whispered. "Once." Downstairs, Dr. Pembroke spoke in low tones with Mr. Harbury, who had only recently returned from a business trip, unaware of the full gravity of his daughter's decline. The doctor used careful language phrases like constitutional delicacy and pulmonary weakness, but the meaning seeped through the cracks. Eleanor's fading appearance was not a charm, it was a warning. In the weeks to come, London society would continue to romanticize the consumptive look, unaware that behind locked bedroom doors, countless families watched beauty sharpen into suffering. Fashion had stolen its cues from mortality, mistaking fragility for grace. But in the Harbury household, where every breath Eleanor took felt like borrowed air, no one mistook her appearance for elegance any longer. The fading look was no longer fashionable. It was terrifying. The Harbury drawing room had once been a place of soft laughter and polite conversation, where callers arrived in twos and threes to exchange gossip beneath the gentle glow of gas lamps. Its wallpaper, pale green with silver vines, caught the afternoon light in a way that made the entire room shimmer faintly, as though touched by spring even in winter. But now, as pneumonia-haunted winds pressed against the windows and Eleanor's illness worsened, that warm shimmer had dulled into something colder, something still, something that felt almost afraid to breathe. The afternoon began like any other call. Mrs. Ashford and her daughter, women known for their keen observations and their even keener tongues, stepped inside, carrying the faint scent of lavender water and social expectation. Their voices floated through the hallway like ribbons, winding toward the drawing room where Mrs. Harbury waited, with a composure so fragile it seemed sculpted from frost. "Such a pleasure to call upon you," Mrs. Ashford chirped as she settled herself onto the settee. "We have been terribly concerned. We heard your dear Eleanor has taken a turn." The remark, though wrapped in politeness, struck like ice. "She is resting upstairs," Mrs. Harbury replied, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "The winter has been unkind to her." The younger Miss Ashford cast her eyes around the room, noting how the lace curtains trembled in the slight draught from the always open window in the upstairs chamber. "That cough going about is dreadful," she murmured, smoothing the fabric of her gloves. "One hears it everywhere. Everywhere. In the streets, in workhouses, in parlours like this one, where silence crept in like a cautious guest. As if summoned by their words, a sound drifted faintly from the floor above a cough, delicate yet unmistakable, muffled behind layers of blankets and distance. The guests froze. Mrs. Ashford's smile flickered, collapsing like thin paper touched by flame. "Oh," she said softly, "that sounds—" But she did not finish. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room recognized the timbre of it. Not a cold, not a passing ailment. Something deeper, something hollow, something that echoed in the chest. For a moment, no one moved. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to quiet itself, its crackles subdued as though unwilling to interrupt the tension. Outside, a carriage rattled by, its wheels grinding through frost, but even that sound felt distant, like part of a world that no longer quite touched the Harbury home. Miss Ashford opened her mouth as though to speak, then closed it again. Her eyes drifted toward her mother, who gave a barely perceptible nod. A decision had been made in silence. "We mustn't stay long," Mrs. Ashford said gently. "Your home must be kept peaceful." Peaceful, another polite word for sick room. They rose together, their skirts brushing the carpet with soft shivers of fabric. Before leaving, Mrs. Ashford touched Mrs. Harbury's arm with a gloved hand. "If there is anything we can do—" But the sentence died before reaching its promise. Compassion, even sincere, had limits when illness cast its long shadow, especially this illness. When the door closed behind them, the drawing room seemed to exhale a slow, mournful sigh that stirred the dust motes drifting lazily in the gaslight. The room had never felt emptier or more aware. Mrs. Harbury remained seated, staring at the space where her guests had been. Her hands trembled now, free of the need to appear composed. The cough from above came again, softer this time, but the sound sliced her composure all the same. She looked toward the staircase, her breath catching in her throat. The drawing room, once alive with conversation, had fallen silent, not for lack of company, but because grief, unspoken yet heavy, had taken its place among the furnishings. It sat in the empty chairs, lingered along the polished mantel, and hovered in the air like the faintest trace of dust. The entire room, once the social heart of the house, now held stillness like a vigil, an anxious quiet waiting for footsteps, or for news, or for a miracle. Upstairs, Eleanor turned weakly in her bed, unaware that her breath had reshaped the very atmosphere of her home. And downstairs, her mother felt deep in her bones that the silence would only deepen in the days to come. The workhouse infirmary always seemed colder at night, as though darkness itself slipped through the cracks in the stone walls. Lanterns hung from iron hooks cast pale, trembling circles of light across the rows of narrow cots, illuminating thin blankets, hollow cheeks, and the quiet desperation of those who lay awake listening to the rasp of their own breathing. Within this bleak sanctuary, matron Eliza Harland made her evening rounds a ritual as somber as prayer. Her footsteps echoed softly, measured and unwavering, as she moved between the beds. Her stiff wool skirts whispered across the floor, carrying the faint scent of carbolic soap. She wore a brooch pinned at her collar, a small silver piece engraved with a lily. It was a token from her predecessor, passed on with the whispered instruction, "This place will take your softness if you let it guard it well." And so she had guarded it, carefully, quietly, until this winter, when the coughs returned, like an old sorrow knocking upon a familiar door. Tonight, the air in the infirmary felt thick, not with heat, for the coal fires burned low, but with the heaviness of unspoken dread. Matron Harland lifted her lantern, its flame flickering like a frail heartbeat, as she approached the newest patient, Mary, the 14-year-old girl carried in earlier that morning. The child lay curled on her side, her breaths shallow, each one trembling through her frail frame. Sweat beaded across her brow despite the draught that slipped beneath the door. "Mary," the matron whispered. The girl stirred, opening her eyes pale blue, rimmed with exhaustion. "Am I to go to the quiet ward?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The matron swallowed hard. The quiet ward was what the older inmates called the small room at the end of the corridor where the dying were placed, so their final hours did not disturb the rest. Its walls absorbed more secrets than prayers, and its threshold had become a line most never stepped back across. "No," Matron Harland said gently, brushing a strand of damp hair from Mary's forehead. "Not tonight. You are still with us." Mary's eyes fluttered shut again, as though reassured. But the matron knew what she heard in the child's chest, the soft, crackling wheeze that warned her heart long before her mind accepted it. She rose and continued her rounds. At the next cot, old Mr. Billings coughed into his blanket, the sound echoing deep and hollow. Across from him, a young mother, scarcely older than Mary, cradled her infant, her gaunt arms trembling under the weight of both child and illness. The lantern's glow reflected in her sunken eyes, as she whispered a lullaby between ragged breaths. Matron Harland paused, her hand tightening on the lantern's handle. She had seen this mother grow thinner each week, her vitality draining like water through a sieve. Soon, the child would be orphaned, a fate too common in this place. But there were no remedies strong enough to mend the lungs of the poor. As she moved on, the coughing grew louder, building like an uneasy choir. Some voices were sharp, others muffled. Some carried a rattle that chilled the matron's blood. She stopped before each patient, checking for fever, offering sips of tepid water, adjusting blankets too thin to ward off the winter chill. There were no miracles here, only endurance. She approached the final cot, a man with a face hollowed beyond his years, his eyes half open as though caught between waking and slipping into some distant realm. His breathing stuttered, then resumed in a labored rhythm. "Matron," he rasped, Is it nearly done?" Her throat tightened. She knelt beside him, placing a warm hand on his cold fingers. "You are safe," she murmured. "Rest." The man closed his eyes, trusting her words because they were the only comfort he had left. The lantern flame trembled. Somewhere down the hallway, another cough erupted high, fearful, lonely. Matron Harland stood slowly, drawing in a long, steadying breath. She turned toward the quiet ward door. Soon, she knew, she would have to move someone there. Maybe Mary, maybe the infant's mother, maybe the man who had just asked her if the end was near. But for tonight, she let the infirmary remain whole. She let her softness remain intact. Outside, the workhouse loomed in the darkness, indifferent to the suffering housed within. But inside, as the matron lifted her lantern and resumed her slow walk between the cots, her presence softened the sharp edges of the night. And though illness clung to every breath, every blanket, every trembling body, for a brief moment, her quiet vigilance made the darkness feel almost bearable. The lamps along Wellington Row had long since dimmed when Dr. Alistair Pembroke stepped out of his carriage, the night pressing around him like a damp wool cloak. Midnight in London carried its own peculiar silence, one woven not of peace but of exhaustion. The fog lay thick and low, muffling footsteps, swallowing breaths, and turning the gaslight into trembling halos. He pulled his coat tighter, feeling the familiar weight of his stethoscope against his chest. Tonight, he had not been summoned. He had come of his own accord. Something had been gnawing at him since the afternoon, a truth he had tried to swallow, tried to bury in the steady routine of his visits. But truth, like illness, had a way of rising back to the surface, refusing to be silenced. Inside the Harbury home, the hallway was lit only by a single lamp, its glow soft and reluctant. A servant startled when she saw him. "Doctor? We didn't expect—" "I know," he murmured, removing his hat. "But I must speak with Mr. and Mrs. Harbury. It cannot wait." The servant hesitated, then nodded and slipped upstairs. Moments later, Mr. Harbury descended the staircase, still dressed in evening attire, though his waistcoat hung open, as if he had changed in haste. Behind him, Mrs. Harbury appeared, her expression tight with fear. Midnight visits from doctors never came with good news. "Dr. Pembroke," Mr. Harbury said, voice low. "Is Eleanor worse?" The question struck the doctor with painful accuracy. He gestured toward the drawing room. "May we speak privately?" They entered the room, its fire reduced to faint embers glowing like the last coals of hope. The perfume of earlier hours had faded, leaving only the sharp scent of extinguished candlewick. Mrs. Harbury clutched her shawl. Mr. Harbury stood rigid, as if bracing for impact. Dr. Pembroke's gloved hands tightened around his hat. His voice, usually calm and authoritative, emerged brittle. "I examined Eleanor again this evening," he began. "Her lungs, the congestion has deepened." Mrs. Harbury's face paled. "But the tonics, the powders, they ease discomfort," he said carefully, "but they do not cure what has taken hold." The fire crackled faintly, a sound too gentle for the weight of the moment. "What are you saying?" Mr. Harbury asked, his voice thick. Dr. Pembroke hesitated longer this time. His training had taught him to temper truth with gentleness. But tonight, the gentleness felt crueler than honesty. "I fear," he said slowly, "that Eleanor is entering the more advanced stage of consumption." Silence expanded around them, vast and suffocating. Mrs. Harbury closed her eyes, gripping the back of a chair to steady herself. Mr. Harbury stared at the doctor as though daring him to retract the words. "How long?" the father whispered. Dr. Pembroke looked down, as though ashamed of his own helplessness. "It is impossible to say. Weeks, perhaps. Months, if we are fortunate. She is young. Youth may yet lend her strength. But," his voice faltered, "the progression is unmistakable." Mrs. Harbury let out a quiet sound, something between a gasp and a sob. The room's air thickened with grief. The doctor stepped forward, unable to remain distant. "I should have spoken sooner," he said in a low, tormented voice. "But hope is a powerful thing. I wanted, perhaps selfishly, to give her more time without fear." Mr. Harbury's jaw tightened. "You did what you believed best." But Dr. Pembroke shook his head. "There is more." He gathered himself, then confessed what had haunted him since hearing of the milk, the workhouses, the growing cases across the city. "This illness spreads more widely now than in past winters, not only through air, but through cattle as well, through milk, through countless unseen paths." Mrs. Harbury's eyes widened with fresh horror. "Then, Eleanor, it is possible," he whispered. "The city is growing sick beneath our very feet." A distant cough echoed from upstairs, thin, trembling, unmistakable. It cut through the midnight stillness like a blade. Mrs. Harbury pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Mr. Harbury turned away, shoulders rigid with the effort to hold himself together. The doctor lowered his voice further. "I will continue to treat her. I will not abandon her. But you must prepare yourselves for the possibility that medicine may not keep pace with her illness." The confession hung in the room like lingering smoke. He replaced his hat, bowing his head in both apology and sorrow. "I am so very sorry." When he stepped back into the cold night, the fog swallowed him once more. The street lamps flickered above him, their light frail against the darkness. He paused beside his carriage, gripping its edge as if the entire weight of London rested upon his shoulders. Behind him, in the quiet, trembling house, Eleanor coughed again, and the city, wide awake in its fear, seemed to hold its breath with her. In a quiet townhouse on the opposite side of Wellington Row, another story of winter sorrow unfolded, one that mirrored the Harburys in its dread, yet bore its own peculiar ache. Here lived the Ashcrofts, a family known for their composure, their refinement, and the quiet pride they took in their eldest child, Thomas. He had once been the picture of youthful vigor, tall, intelligent, with the kind of earnest charm that made neighbors speak hopefully of his future. But consumption showed little regard for futures. It entered the Ashcroft household with the same stealth it had shown elsewhere, a cough dismissed, a flush admired, a fatigue explained away by studies and long evenings by the fire. But now, as January deepened into a bitter, breath-stealing cold, Thomas lay in the upper bedroom, too weak even to turn his head toward the window. The curtains, embroidered with silver-threaded vines, stirred faintly in the constant draught. His mother had insisted the window remain open, just as Dr. Pembroke advised at the Harbury home. "Air must circulate," the doctors said. "Let freshness meet the lungs." But tonight, the breeze that drifted over Thomas's fevered skin felt like a whisper from the grave. Mrs. Ashcroft stood near the foot of the bed, her hands clasped before her, fingers white from the pressure of her grip. She had spent every hour of the last week in this room, watching her son shrink beneath the weight of his illness. His once bright eyes had grown too large for his face, shadowed by hollows etched in grey. Yet even now he offered her a faint smile. "Mother," he rasped, "you should rest." Her breath trembled. "I will rest when you do, darling." At the corner of the room stood Mr. Ashcroft, grim-faced and silent, the kind of silence that belonged to men taught never to crack under grief. But his shoulders drooped, and when he brushed a hand across his brow, it shook. Between them, a photographer prepared his equipment. It was a custom, both morbid and tender, the portrait of a loved one on the brink of death. Not quite post-mortem photography yet, in truth, not far from it. Victorian families clung to images the way sailors clung to rope during storms. "We want him as he is," Mrs. Ashcroft whispered, her voice cracking. "Still with us." Thomas managed a faint laugh, though it dissolved into a weak cough. "Will it look terribly dramatic?" he murmured. The photographer, a solemn man in a dark coat, offered a gentle nod. "No drama, sir, only truth." He arranged the light so it fell softly across Thomas's face, illuminating the ethereal glow consumption bestowed upon its victims. It was awful, this beauty, cruel. His cheeks flushed unnaturally, his lips pale as winter roses, his eyes shining with fever's fragile brilliance. Yet through the lens, he appeared almost angelic. "Hold still," the photographer instructed. Thomas exhaled shakily. "I haven't the strength to do otherwise." The shutter clicked a quiet sound, but one that seemed to echo through the room like a tolling bell. Mrs. Ashcroft pressed a gloved hand to her mouth, tears spilling despite her effort to remain composed. When the photographer packed away his tools, promising the finished portrait within days, Thomas closed his eyes. "Mother," he whispered, barely audible, "promise me. Keep the portrait where you can see it. I don't want to be forgotten." She knelt at his side, taking his frail hand in hers. "You will never be forgotten," she vowed. "Never." Snow began to fall outside, silent flakes drifting past the open window, melting upon the floorboards. Mr. Ashcroft moved to close the window at last, but Thomas stirred weakly. "No, leave it," he murmured. "I like the cold. It feels clean." The wind sighed through the room, brushing lightly across his thin face. Mrs. Ashcroft bent low, placing a trembling kiss on his forehead. And as the night deepened, the faint image captured inside the photographer's wooden box, Thomas's last portrait, became, without the family realizing it, a relic, a memory sealed in silver and shadow, a keepsake for the living, a farewell for the dying. The winter fog had thinned by dawn, but the gloom it left behind clung stubbornly to the narrow streets of Westminster. Chimneys exhaled slow plumes of smoke, rooftops wept with melting frost, and the alleyways, those crooked veins of the old city, held their breath in stagnant cold. It was into this bleak morning that Mr. Horace Linton, sanitary inspector for the Central District, began his rounds with a notebook tucked beneath his arm. His coat was thick, his boots polished, but nothing in his attire could shield him from the weight of what he witnessed each day. As he stepped into the first court, a cramped corridor of leaning tenements, his breath mingled with the lingering odors of damp brick, rotting refuse, and illness. Always illness. It seemed to seep through the mortar like an invisible tide. He flipped open his notebook. Its pages, creased and smudged, bore the evidence of months spent documenting misery. "Dwelling No. 12, he wrote, pausing to observe the windows above him, clouded from within, curtains drawn tight despite the hour, persistent reports of coughing, family of 6, insufficient ventilation. From somewhere inside, a sharp, racking cough answered his pen. He closed his eyes briefly. Consumption did not simply haunt these neighborhoods, it devoured them. A door opened to his left, creaking reluctantly. A woman emerged, her shawl wrapped tightly around her gaunt frame. Her eyes, ringed with fatigue, flicked toward his badge and then downward in a mix of resignation and dread. "Inspector Linton," she said softly, "you've come about the noise complaints?" "No," he replied gently. "I'm surveying for health safety this week." Her hand tightened around the frayed edge of her shawl. "It's my husband," she whispered. "His cough keeps the whole building awake. I fear it is the same illness that took the Carter boy last month." Linton's expression softened. "I'm sorry. Has a doctor seen him?" She shook her head. "We can't afford one, sir." He made a small note in his book, an action that felt painfully inadequate. "I will send word to the infirmary," he said. "Someone will come." But whether the infirmary had space, whether it had hope left to give, was another question entirely. He moved on, his boots splashing through puddles of thawing ice. Children watched him from behind doorways, their eyes dark and wary. Every household feared an inspector's visit. His notebook could condemn a family to relocation or temporary closure, outcomes sometimes as cruel as disease. At the far end of the court, Linton climbed a flight of narrow wooden stairs leading to the upper rooms. The boards sank beneath his weight, groaning like tired lungs. On the landing, he found what he dreaded most: a thin smear of darkened blood upon the floorboards, hastily wiped, but still visible in the slanted morning light. He knelt, touching it carefully. Recent. Behind the nearest door, he heard a child coughing, a sound too light, too raw, too hauntingly familiar. He knocked. A drawn-faced man opened the door. "What is it?" he asked, though he already knew. "May I enter?" Linton asked softly. The room was barely large enough to hold a bed, a stove, and a single cracked window. 3 children huddled beneath blankets, their breaths quick and shallow. The eldest, a girl of perhaps 9, clutched her chest with each cough. Linton's hand trembled as he wrote, "Severe overcrowding. Suspected tuberculosis. Immediate intervention required." The man lowered his eyes. "Will you take my children away?" The inspector closed his notebook, feeling its weight like a stone in his palm. "I don't wish to take anything from you," he said, voice thickening. "I simply wish to stop this illness from taking more." For a moment, silence stretched thin as thread between them. When Linton finally stepped back into the street, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the distant chiming of church bells and the haunting chorus of coughs emerging from countless unseen windows. He turned a page in his notebook, but his hand hesitated before writing. How many times had he documented these same conditions: damp rooms, thin walls, air that stagnated instead of circulating? How many families had he recorded in careful penmanship, only to watch their names fade from the city's living register and drift into memory? He drew a slow breath, the cold stinging his lungs. Then he wrote, "The city is unwell, not merely the people, the city itself. Action is urgent, before the fog clears and reveals only loss beneath it." He closed the book, and in the distance, London exhaled a long, weary sigh as though it, too, felt its sickness deep in the spaces where the light could no longer reach. The morning sunlight in St. Michael's Cathedral pierced through the stained glass, painting the cold stone floor in fractured shards of ruby, sapphire, and amber. Yet even the brilliance of colour could not warm the sanctuary, for within its walls a quiet pall had settled. Choir practice was underway, but the notes that should have risen pure and steady through the nave now wavered, faltered, and broke into coughs. Thomas Avery, the youngest tenor, stood at his assigned pew, gripping the hymn book as though it were a lifeline. His small hands shook slightly, and his cheeks, once bright with youth, bore a persistent, unnatural flush. The breath he drew to sing felt shallow and ragged, each note emerging as a fragile whisper rather than the confident tone expected in the cathedral's lofty acoustics. The choirmaster, Mr. Whitcomb, observed quietly from the pulpit, his face drawn with concern. "Again, Thomas," he murmured. "Take the hymn from the top." His voice carried neither anger nor impatience, only careful, cultivated urgency. The boy obeyed, opening his mouth and attempting the familiar melody. A single phrase drifted, thin as cobweb, then broke into a rasping cough that echoed off the stone columns. The other boys paused, uncertain. Some looked toward the warm glow of their mother's or father's eyes in the gallery above. Others shifted nervously, aware that the illness creeping among them was no ordinary winter malady. Tuberculosis, whispered about in hushed tones among clergy and parents alike, was making its presence known, and it did not discriminate between rank, age, or virtue. Thomas clutched the hymn book tighter, attempting to summon strength from the familiar inked notes, but the effort was in vain. Each breath seemed to cost more than the last, his chest aching with the silent insistence of disease. A cough escaped again, sharp and involuntary, scattering a few stray tears across his pale cheeks. Mr. Whitcomb descended the pulpit steps and approached the boy with careful steps. "Come here," he said softly. He lifted Thomas's chin gently, observing the subtle quiver of his eyelids, the way his shoulders sagged despite the effort to remain upright. "Do you feel faint?" Thomas shook his head, though his lips trembled. "No, only tired, sir." The choirmaster's eyes darkened with a quiet, almost imperceptible dread. He had seen this before: boys who faded from life as swiftly and cruelly as a candle flame caught by wind. "You may rest," he said finally. "Step to the side." As Thomas shuffled toward the side of the nave, the other boys resumed the hymn, but the harmony felt hollow without his voice. The stone seemed colder, the colored light less vibrant, as though the cathedral itself mourned the subtle weakening of one of its young charges. Parents arriving for morning service noticed the stillness, the faint cough that had escaped into the pews. Their whispers were cautious, measured. "Is he ill? Could it be the White Death?" No one wished to name it aloud, yet the fear hung palpably in the vaulted air. In the vestry, the organist shook his head, muttering about damp winter air and overcrowded living quarters, aware that the sources of illness lay far beyond the cathedral doors. The choir boys' homes, narrow, poorly ventilated, filled with warmth-seeking families, were fertile ground for the disease. Tuberculosis crept from room to room, from voice to voice, leaving its signature in coughs, flushed cheeks, and failing stamina. Thomas sat quietly to the side, his hymn book resting on his lap. He tried to hum softly to himself, but even that effort drew a cough. A single tear escaped his eye, tracing a thin line down a hollow cheek. Outside, the city moved on, carriages rattled through frost-laden streets, shopkeepers prepared their wares, and fog lingered low over Westminster like a watching spectre. Inside the cathedral, however, a single voice was fading, and with it a measure of innocence and hope that could not be replaced. Tuberculosis, silent and persistent, had claimed another note, leaving only the echo of what once was, and a space too fragile for any melody to fill. The narrow streets of Lambeth were slick with frost, the cobblestones glinting faintly under the dim gaslights, when Mrs. Agatha Penrose made her way to the pawnshop. Her shawl was drawn tightly about her thin shoulders, the fur trim brushing the tops of her gloves, but it offered little warmth against the sharp wind that sliced through the alleyways. She clutched a small parcel to her chest, inside which lay the silverware she had once brought home as a bride, gifted by a husband, who now lay pale beneath a white sheet, taken by that merciless, invisible predator that London whispered about in hushed tones. Consumption. Her steps echoed quietly against the buildings, each one measured, deliberate. Neighbors peeked from curtained windows, noting the solitary figure moving through the fog like a shadow of grief. They had long since learned not to speak aloud of the disease that stole breath from the young and old alike, preferring instead to murmur quietly behind lace drapes. But everyone knew, instinctively, when consumption had entered a home, it left its mark not only on the body but on the air itself, heavier, colder, sorrowful. The pawnshop smelled of iron and old wood. Behind the counter, Mr. Keating adjusted the ledger as Agatha entered, bowing slightly. He had known her years, had witnessed the slow transformation of her life from hope to despair, from warmth to shadow. She placed the parcel carefully upon the counter. The silver inside gleamed faintly in the gaslight, tarnished now by neglect and the damp winter air. I need to sell this," she said softly, her voice trembling, "to pay for him." Mr. Keating's eyes softened. "For your husband?" Agatha nodded. The cough that had racked him in the final weeks lingered still in her memory, a harsh, uneven sound that echoed endlessly in the small rooms of their house. The doctor had come and gone, prescriptions offered and rejected by the reality of poverty, yet the disease had taken its due without pause. She had watched him fade beneath the thin blankets, his hands clutching at sheets as if they could hold life itself. "I cannot afford the remedies any longer," she said. I need money for his care, or for his burial. I do not know which." Mr. Keating measured the silver with careful hands, turning each piece over slowly. His expression betrayed little judgment, though the ledger before him seemed to grow heavier with the weight of sorrow. "It will not be much," he murmured, and placed a modest sum upon the counter. "But it is honest money. Perhaps it will ease what you must face." Agatha's fingers trembled as she picked up the coins. The weight felt nothing compared to the emptiness that had settled in her chest. She imagined her husband's face, so pale it seemed carved from marble, and felt a shiver run through her thin frame. She had married him with hope, with love, with the dream of family and comfort. Now all that remained were faint echoes, memories sealed in silver and ash. The street outside pressed close as she stepped back into the fog. Children's laughter from a distant alley rang hollow, for she heard only the echoes of the coughing, the reminders that life could be stolen even as it was lived. The wind carried the faint scent of coal smoke and distant refuse, mingling with the iron tang of loss. She paused briefly, glancing at the small parcel, now emptied of its contents. The silver had gone, yet the debt of grief remained heavier than any coin. As she trudged home, her steps slow and deliberate, she realized that Victorian London demanded sacrifices in ways the world would not acknowledge. The loss of a husband, the fading of hope, the selling of a wedding silver, these were currencies all its own. And everywhere she looked, in the narrow lanes and dim doorways, in every cough that pierced the morning air, the city whispered the same unrelenting truth. Tuberculosis claimed not only the body but the life it had touched, leaving sorrow and survival intertwined, inseparable and merciless. The House of Commons, usually a theatre of eloquence and routine, seemed subdued under the chill of January's grey light. Gas lamps flickered above the polished desks, throwing uneven shadows across the faces of men who had long since perfected the art of measured debate. Yet on this particular day, the measured tone had cracked. Fear had entered the chamber alongside the draughts that crept beneath doors and through ill-fitting windows. Tuberculosis, the silent predator of London, had drawn its first inkling of recognition among the nation's lawmakers. Cases multiplied in the slums and the workhouses, spreading with relentless precision, yet still largely invisible to the affluent. It did not announce itself with crimson banners or ringing bells. Instead, it whispered through the corridors of the poor, through coughs muffled behind handkerchiefs, through faces that grew too thin, too flushed, too bright to ignore. "Sir," began one member, his voice unusually sharp, cutting through the murmurs, "we cannot continue to ignore the evidence presented by the Public Health Office. Entire districts are succumbing to this insidious disease, and still the city fails to act with adequate measures." Another rose, adjusting the cuffs of his coat. "It is not our fault that the poor cannot maintain proper hygiene. We provide what we can, boards, coal, and, in some instances, rudimentary medical aid. But we are not gods, nor can we remake the habits of generations overnight." A murmur of assent, mingled with unease, spread through the chamber. Men shifted in their seats. The words, though spoken in formal restraint, carried the weight of dread. Sir Thomas Radcliffe, known for his eloquence and decisive speeches, slammed his hand lightly upon the bench. "We are neither powerless nor blind. Have we not reports? Have we not petitions from mothers, from matrons, from clergy? Children die, fathers die, mothers weep at the windows of their darkened homes, while Parliament debates what is fashionable or convenient. This is no question of charity alone, it is a matter of survival." The chamber, erupted into a volley of voices, each man eager to assert authority, to assert reason, to assert distance from responsibility. Words collided, echoed against the high ceilings, bouncing into shadows that seemed heavier than the arguments themselves. Some whispered of quarantine, others of financial impossibility. One Conservative member even suggested that the poor, being naturally delicate or morally lax, bore some responsibility for their own decline. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken, as if it too carried the weight of the unseen epidemic. Outside, fog pressed against the building's stone walls, muffling the distant clatter of streetcars and horse-drawn carriages. London itself seemed to listen, holding its breath in synchrony with those who argued above. Finally, Radcliffe's voice rose above the others. We must act. Sanitary reform, improved ventilation, clean milk, proper housing, these are not luxuries, they are necessities. The disease will not wait while we squabble over politics and pennies. A tense silence followed. Men lowered their heads, acknowledging the truth beneath the decorum and posturing. Even in the House, the reality of tuberculosis demanded recognition. The city itself was in peril, not only in its poorest districts, but in the very lifeblood of its population. Minutes later, the Speaker banged his gavel, though it offered little relief from the charged atmosphere. The debates would continue for weeks. Bills drafted, petitions considered, yet the spectre of death that stalked London's streets remained patient and implacable. Outside, the fog shifted. A single cough echoed faintly down the cobbled street below, rising from a tenement where a child lay feverish in a narrow bed. And for a moment, the grandeur of Parliament felt fragile, suspended over the city's silent suffering. For in Victorian London, argument and eloquence could not halt the steady, merciless advance of the White Death. The infirmary at St. Bartholomew's Hospital was dimly lit. The lanterns hung along the stone walls, casting long, flickering shadows that danced like restless spirits. It was the dead of night, yet Nurse Margaret Fenwick moved with quiet precision, her footsteps soft against the cold, worn floor. Sleep had been a luxury she abandoned long ago. Exhaustion was a companion, yes, but the work of tending the consumptive demanded vigilance that rest could not permit. She passed the rows of cots, each occupied by children and adults alike, all breathing thinly, all caught in the slow erasure of the White Death. The faint rattle of lungs, the delicate flushes of fever, the occasional muffled cough, they were her constant companions, sounds that would never leave her memory. Margaret's hands, steady yet weary, smoothed blankets, adjusted pillows, and wiped the damp sheen from fevered foreheads. In the corner, a boy of 12 stirred, his small body trembling with each inhalation. His mother, seated beside him, whispered soft prayers, though Margaret knew the words could not protect him. She knelt by the cot, feeling for the faintest pulse beneath the delicate skin, noting the subtle flutter that spoke of the lungs' struggle. "You'll rest soon," she murmured, though she knew it was not true, not for him and not for herself. The night stretched endlessly, each hour a measured beat between breaths, a rhythm set not by clock or candle but by the fragile lives around her. Margaret's eyes, rimmed with dark crescents, scanned the infirmary ceaselessly. Every cough was a signal, every movement a warning. Fatigue weighed heavily, yet she did not falter. To falter was to risk a life that already seemed so precariously poised between hope and oblivion. A young woman lay near the center, her breath uneven and shallow. She had been admitted days earlier, her family too poor to provide the comforts of home, too desperate to ignore the early signs of illness. Margaret adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, noting the rapid pulse beneath her fingertips. The girl stirred, whispering something unintelligible, then coughed a dry, rasping sound that punctuated the still night. "Peace, my dear," Margaret said softly, smoothing the damp hair from her brow. "I am here." "You are not alone." Across the ward, another child began coughing, a staccato interruption that drew the nurse immediately. She moved without hesitation, checking for fever, offering water, and murmuring reassurances, though each sound she made seemed swallowed by the cavernous room. The night was long, and the work unceasing. Margaret's own body ached with the strain of endless vigilance. Her fingers trembled with fatigue, her back stiffened from hours of bending, yet she could not leave, not even for a moment. Sleep would bring weakness, weakness could bring death, and the White Death waited for no one. She paused for a breath, leaning against the rough wall for a heartbeat. Outside, the fog pressed against the hospital's windows, muffling distant footsteps and the occasional carriage. The city exhaled slowly, but inside these stone walls, it felt as though the very air was thick with despair, heavy with the whispered coughs of countless victims. By dawn, her eyes had not closed, her hands had not rested. The ward remained alive with murmurs, with coughs, with shallow, rasping breaths. Margaret adjusted another pillow, whispered words of comfort, and glanced at the pale, still faces of those around her. She refused to sleep, for in her wakefulness lay the fragile thread between life and death. And as the first weak light of morning crept into the infirmary, filtering through the frost-lined windows, Nurse Margaret Fenwick remained steadfast, a solitary guardian against the silent tide of the White Death that had claimed London's nights and threatened to claim its mornings. The first weak light of dawn spilled through the high windows of the Harbury bedroom, cutting pale, narrow lines across the floorboards. The frost that clung stubbornly to the windowpanes glimmered faintly in the morning sun, and the air, though cold, carried a fragile clarity that seemed almost unnatural after nights heavy with fog and dread. Eleanor lay propped in her bed, the thin blankets drawn up to her chin, her body trembling slightly with the residual chill from the night. The bed itself, carefully arranged by Mrs. Harbury before sunrise, bore the imprint of hours of worry and watchfulness. The sheets had been changed with meticulous care, washed in boiling water, and scented faintly with lavender, a scent meant to soothe, yet it carried only the bittersweet reminder of her frailty. The mattress, firm and narrow, rose gently under her thin form, the feather bed beneath compressed unevenly by the nights she had spent restless, coughing, and fevered. Her mother hovered at the bedside, pale-faced and silent, adjusting the pillow beneath Eleanor's head with hands that shook despite the effort to appear steady. The morning light caught the glimmer of sweat on Eleanor's brow, highlighting the delicate flush in her cheeks so often admired by outsiders for its deceptive beauty, now merely a herald of illness. "You slept some, my dear?" Mrs. Harbury whispered, her voice tentative, almost breaking the silence of the room. Eleanor's lips parted in a faint smile, but her breath came in shallow, uneven gusts. "Some," she murmured. Her voice, soft as the rustle of silk, trembled faintly against the stillness. But the night, it was long. Indeed, the night had been long. She had lain listening to the faint sounds of the city beyond the window, the muffled clatter of carriages, the distant toll of a church bell, each noise somehow amplified by the silence of her own room. Her cough had come in ragged bursts, echoing faintly in the confined space, a reminder of the frailty of her lungs. She had gripped the blankets tightly, willing the pain to pass, wishing for relief that would not arrive. Now, as the sun's pale light filled the room, it washed over her bed in a soft, unforgiving clarity. Every contour of her thin form, every trace of the fever that lingered beneath her skin, was made visible. The blankets, pressed and folded, no longer concealed the truth. The sheets, laundered and perfumed, could not hide the quiet encroachment of illness. Her mother smoothed a hand over Eleanor's hair, inhaling the faint, sweet scent of lavender mingled with the sharp tang of sickness. She dared not speak aloud what she feared, that the White Death had marked her child, and that the struggle ahead would be merciless. The room remained silent, save for the soft sound of Eleanor's shallow breathing. The morning light continued to creep across the floorboards, illuminating dust motes that hovered like restless spirits above the bed. Even the furniture seemed subdued, the polished wood and embroidered cushions now witnesses to a slow, unrelenting invasion. Eleanor shifted slightly, the movement drawing a faint groan from her lips. Her mother pressed the blankets closer, tucking the edges around her thin form. She whispered soft words of comfort, prayers disguised as murmurs, coaxing warmth and reassurance where medicine could not. Outside, London moved on. The fog had lifted, revealing a city bustling with activity, indifferent to the quiet suffering in its homes. Carriages rattled along cobblestones, shopkeepers arranged goods for the day, and the wind carried the faint scent of coal and frost. But within the walls of the Harbury bedroom, time seemed to pause. The bed, washed in morning light, was no longer merely a place of rest. It was a sanctuary, a stage upon which the delicate, fragile struggle between life and the white death played out with quiet intensity. Every breath Eleanor drew, every pulse beneath her skin, became a testament to endurance, a fragile heartbeat against the relentless tide of Victorian tuberculosis. And as the sun rose higher, spilling brighter light across the room, the Harburys understood the cruel truth. Even the morning could not banish the shadows that lurked in the lungs of their child. The apothecary's bottle gleamed faintly on the bedside table, its contents a pale, opalescent liquid that seemed to hold within it all the hope Eleanor's family could muster. The label, printed in careful script, promised vigor and relief. A tonic formulated to strengthen weak lungs, to soothe coughs, and to sustain fragile life. It had the faintest scent of herbs and bitters, sharp yet oddly sweet, curling in the cold morning air of her room like a hesitant visitor. Mrs. Harbury held the bottle with trembling hands, noting how small it seemed, how fragile, as if the slightest tilt could spill all of its promise into the shadows of the room. She placed a measured dose in a tiny porcelain cup, its rim thin and chipped with age. Eleanor, propped among the embroidered cushions of her bed, looked at it with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Each sip, they all knew, carried not only potential relief, but the silent knowledge that it might offer little beyond the comforting illusion of care. "You must drink it slowly," Mrs. Harbury instructed, her voice soft yet taut with anxiety. "It will ease your breathing, if only for a moment." Eleanor lifted the cup with a tentative hand. Her fingers were pale and slender, trembling as they touched the smooth porcelain. The liquid gleamed faintly in the morning sun, a fragile light in a room weighed down by sickness and dread. She sipped carefully, the bitter sweetness sliding down her throat, leaving a warmth that spread faintly through her chest. For a few moments, relief seemed possible. Her cough stilled to a mere whisper, and the tightness in her chest loosened slightly. Her mother exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding. Outside, the fog clung low over the rooftops, yet the room felt almost brighter, almost safe, as though the tonic itself had created a small island of warmth against the winter chill. But the peace was fleeting. Eleanor's eyes, still bright with fever, grew heavy, and the flush on her cheeks deepened. The tonic could not conquer what had taken root in her lungs. It could soothe, it could sustain, but it could not halt the merciless advance of the White Death. Dr. Pembroke, summoned by the Harburys that morning, arrived with a quiet gravity. He observed the administration of the tonic, his hands folded behind his back, lips pressed into a thin line. He had prescribed this very formulation countless times, yet each administration weighed on him with renewed dread. No concoction could undo the slow destruction that tuberculosis wrought in young bodies. "You are taking it correctly," he said finally, his voice measured and calm, though shadowed by concern. "It may ease the discomfort. Do not expect miracles." Eleanor tried to smile. The attempt was thin, fragile, but it carried a flicker of defiance. "I will try," she whispered. her voice almost lost beneath the faint creak of the floorboards. Her mother hovered close, smoothing a damp strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "It is brave of you," she said, "braver than I can imagine." The nurse, who had refused to sleep through nights like this, adjusted the blanket around Eleanor's thin frame. Each movement was precise, careful, deliberate. The tonic's warmth mingled with the faint heat of the girl's fevered skin, creating a fragile, deceptive sense of comfort that all in the room clung to desperately. Beyond the window, London moved on, indifferent and unknowing. The streets rattled with carriages, the baker's men shouted faintly as they carried flour, and children played despite the cold, their laughter brittle in the fog-laden morning. But within the Harbury bedroom, time had slowed to the rhythm of Eleanor's breath, the delicate rise and fall of her chest, and the quiet reassurance that, for now, a tonic could lend strength even in the shadow of inevitable decline. Yet everyone knew, in the hush that followed each sip, that hope and medicine were fragile allies. The tonic promised vigor, yes, but only for a moment, enough, perhaps, to allow Eleanor to breathe a little easier, to make the night less cruel, to let her family imagine, if only for a few heartbeats, that life might still hold them. The hospital at St. Giles rose like a grim sentinel against the morning fog, its stone walls blackened with soot and age. Inside, the corridors carried a scent that could not be mistaken, the sharp, acrid tang of carbolic. It clung to the air in thick, stubborn waves, weaving between beds and stretching to the high ceilings, mingling faintly with the lingering odor of damp wool and unwashed bodies. It was a smell that spoke of antisepsis, of desperate attempts to conquer what could not be seen, and yet it carried beneath it an undertone of inevitability, the knowledge that illness would prevail despite human efforts. Nurse Margaret Fenwick moved silently along the corridor, lantern in hand, her shadow stretching long and thin across the stone floor. Her eyes were wide and wary, trained to notice every subtle change in the ward. A shiver passed through her as the wind pressed against the high windows, rattling panes and stirring the faint mist of breath that rose from patients who lay still, pale, and trembling under thin blankets. At the first row of cots, children lay curled, their small bodies quivering with fever. Their coughs were soft yet relentless, echoing faintly against the stone walls, amplified by the emptiness of the high-ceilinged space. Margaret knelt beside a boy no older than 10, adjusting his blanket and smoothing damp strands of hair from his fevered forehead. His eyes opened briefly, glimmering with fear and confusion. "You are safe," she whispered, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I am here. You will breathe." The boy coughed again, dry and rasping, and a faint trace of blood stained the corner of his lips. Margaret's stomach tightened. She had seen this too many times. The telltale marks that consumption left behind, small and easily overlooked until they became impossible to ignore. Further down the ward, a woman lay propped against a stack of pillows, her infant in her arms. The child's tiny hands clutched at her shawl as the mother whispered gentle prayers, her voice trembling with exhaustion. The nurse adjusted the infant's position, careful not to disturb the frail balance of warmth and comfort. Every cot, every patient, carried the same silent story. The carbolic, meant to stave off infection, could not reach the heart of what ailed them. The antiseptic smells might cleanse the surfaces, might give a sense of control to the attendants, but the disease lived beneath the skin, in the lungs, in the very air they breathed, invisible and persistent. Margaret paused near the end of the ward, noticing a man with a stiff frame, his face etched with pain, his hands trembling as he attempted to lift the thin blanket over his chest. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by a faint wheeze. She knelt beside him, placing a gloved hand gently on his wrist. "Try to rest," she murmured. "The night will pass. You will not be alone." His eyes closed, and for a moment she allowed herself to hope that the comfort of her presence might bring some small reprieve. The lantern flickered as the draught shifted, and Margaret straightened, her shoulders aching with the weight of vigilance. She moved again along the corridor, checking the cots, adjusting blankets, offering water, whispering reassurance. Her body screamed for rest, her mind weighed with the knowledge of all that she could not prevent. Outside, the fog pressed against the hospital walls like a living thing, swallowing the sounds of London carriages, footsteps, the distant hum of markets until only the coughs within remained. The ward smelled strongly of carbolic, yes, but it also carried the essence of human perseverance, the quiet determination to care, to watch, to remain awake when sleep was impossible. It was a sentinel against despair, a small and fragile barrier against the relentless tide of the White Death that had claimed so many before. And as the lantern's glow shifted against the high walls, Nurse Fenwick continued her rounds, each step a testament to endurance, each whispered word a defiance of the inevitable. For in the hospital that smelled of carbolic, life clung stubbornly to its fragile edge, even as the shadow of tuberculosis loomed over every breath. The sanatorium perched atop the gentle rise of Hampstead Hill, like a sentinel against the cold winds that swept through London's outskirts. Its stone facade, austere and unadorned, bore the patina of years spent sheltering those whom society had deemed too fragile for the crowded streets below. From the high windows, the city sprawled in muted silver beneath a blanket of mist, chimneys exhaling smoke like slow, laboring breaths. Yet within these walls, the threat of tuberculosis remained ever present, less immediate, perhaps, than in tenements and workhouses, but insidious in its quiet persistence. Miss Eleanor Harbury had arrived the previous evening, carried up the hill by her mother and a hired carriage, each step measured and careful. The nurses who met her at the entrance moved with the practiced precision of those who had learned to navigate both fear and fragility. They led her to a room bathed in the pale light of a late winter morning, where heavy curtains had been drawn back to allow the feeble sun to touch every corner. The air was crisp, scented faintly with pine and disinfectant, a fragile promise of health in a world steeped in illness. Eleanor's bed was arranged near the open window, the linens crisp and perfumed with lavender. The blankets, thick yet soft, rose beneath her small frame. She lay propped among pillows, chest heaving with the shallow, uneven breaths of a girl weakened by fever and cough. Outside, the wind whipped across the hill, carrying the scent of frost and damp earth, stirring the curtains in quiet ripples. Her mother remained by the bedside, hands folded over one another, eyes darting with anxiety at every subtle movement of her child. "How are you feeling, my dear?" she asked softly. Eleanor attempted a smile, but it faltered beneath the effort. "Better, I think. The air here is clean," she whispered, her voice fragile, like thin glass under pressure. A nurse approached, offering a small cup of the familiar chalky tonic. Eleanor took it with shaking fingers, drawing in a slow breath before drinking. The warmth spread faintly through her chest, a momentary relief, though it could not erase the hollow ache that had begun in her lungs. The sanatorium's corridors were hushed, filled only with the soft shuffle of slippers on stone and the occasional cough that carried from rooms above and below. Each patient, though isolated from the thronging city, bore the weight of the same relentless disease. There were girls like Eleanor, their cheeks flushed with fever, their bodies wan and fragile. Older men, gaunt and silent, whose eyes held the memory of lives steadily consumed. Mothers, silent and watchful, unwilling to leave the side of children they could not protect. Dr. Pembroke arrived mid-morning, his presence measured and calm. He surveyed the room with professional detachment, yet his eyes betrayed the unease that followed him from one household to another. "The air here is beneficial," he said gently, "and the regimen will provide the best chance of preservation. But, as always, we cannot promise cure, only sustenance." Eleanor's mother nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had heard the phrase countless times before, yet it never lost its sting. Sustenance, a word that felt too gentle for the reality it concealed. Through the windows, London stretched like a distant memory, veiled beneath fog and smoke. The city was alive, yet from this height it seemed quieter, smaller, as though the hill itself had become a sanctuary from the constant, invisible threat that moved relentlessly through the streets below. As the sun climbed, its light spilling across the polished floorboards, Eleanor lay back against her pillows, chest rising and falling with careful rhythm. The sanatorium, with its antiseptic walls and vigilant nurses, offered only partial protection, a fragile island of hope in a sea of invisible death. And in that quiet, pale morning light, the girl understood the cruel truth of her existence. Here, on the hill above London, she might breathe more freely, might sleep a little easier, might even feel a measure of peace, but the shadow of the White Death lingered still, patient and merciless, waiting for every moment when vigilance faltered. The candle flickered weakly on the small writing desk beside Eleanor's bed, throwing long, trembling shadows across the polished wood. Her fingers, pale and slender, hovered over the ink and paper, hesitating before she pressed pen to page. The air in the sanatorium was crisp and still, carrying faint whispers of antiseptic and pine. But within her room it seemed heavier, laden with the weight of unspoken words and fading strength. She had been given the tonic, had rested against her pillows, and yet the ache in her chest remained steady and insistent. Each breath was measured, deliberate, a careful negotiation with the disease that had taken root within her. And now, with the quiet of the early evening settling around her, Eleanor felt compelled to write, to reach across the distance that separated her from her family, and leave something tangible behind, something enduring. Her mother had left for the evening, the nurses promising to keep a careful watch, but Eleanor's thoughts drifted persistently to the Harbury household, to her father's stern, anxious eyes, to Henry, who had grown unnaturally quiet in the past weeks, watching her with a cautious reverence, to the servants who had attended her with trembling hands, each cough and shiver a reminder of the fragility of life. She dipped the pen into the ink, the dark liquid glistening under the soft candlelight. Each word she wrote was a small act of defiance against the inevitability of her condition, a quiet declaration that she still existed, still mattered. "Dearest mother," she began, her handwriting careful yet trembling, "if you are reading this, then I am resting, though my body may have grown too weary for much else. Do not grieve for me beyond what is necessary, for I am surrounded by those who care, and the air here, the air is clean, though my lungs protest still." Her hand wavered, the pen leaving uneven lines upon the page. She paused to cough softly into a folded handkerchief, her breath shallow and rattling, before continuing. "I wish I could see the garden in spring once more, the roses you tend so tenderly, the sunlight on the drawing-room carpet. I wish I could hear Henry's laughter echoing through the hallways, untempered by the caution that illness has imposed upon him. Yet these wishes cannot undo what has begun, nor can they forestall the silence that waits in the nights." Tears blurred the ink in small spots, but Eleanor made no effort to blot them. Each mark felt like a testimony, a trace of life still pressing insistently against the encroaching shadow. "Do not forget me, mother, not in sorrow, and not in fear. Remember only that I loved our home, our family, and every moment of warmth you gave me. If strength departs me, let the memory of love remain in your hearts, as it has in mine. And if the days ahead are long and cruel, hold fast to each other, for that is the light that will endure." She set the pen down with careful deliberation, folding the letter with trembling hands and placing it into an envelope marked with her own weak scrawl. She pressed a kiss lightly to the seal, as though the act itself could carry a fragment of her spirit to the Harbury home. The nurses, glancing in, kept their distance, understanding that some moments were too private for even gentle eyes. The candle burned low, guttering slightly as a cold draught slipped beneath the window. Eleanor sank back against the pillows, her breath shallow and uneven. Yet for a brief moment, her mind felt lighter, as if the words she had written could hold off the despair that threatened to press upon her chest. Outside, the fog clung low to the hill, brushing against the sanatorium walls and muffling the distant sounds of London. Within, a letter waited to cross the miles, carrying hope, memory, and love into a household held captive by fear. And in that still room, Eleanor understood the cruel paradox of her existence, that even as the White Death tightened its grip upon her lungs, the spirit could reach beyond it, whispering to those left behind in a language of enduring affection and fragile human grace. The stethoscope lay upon Dr. Alistair Pembroke's lap like a fragile instrument of both hope and dread, its polished brass gleaming faintly in the pale morning light that filtered through the sanatorium window. He held it carefully, turning it over with deliberate fingers, each motion measured, precise, as though the simple act of touching it might summon both cure and judgment simultaneously. Outside, London's fog pressed against the hill with a soft, imperceptible weight, muffling distant carriage wheels and the cries of street hawkers. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and pine, carrying the ghosts of countless breathless nights. Eleanor lay propped against her pillows, her thin frame swathed in blankets, her cheeks flushed with the fever that had taken hold of her lungs. Each shallow inhalation carried a faint rattle, barely perceptible but unmistakable to trained ears. The White Death moved quietly here, weaving between the delicate tissues of her chest, leaving a path of destruction almost invisible in its subtlety. "Breathe slowly," Dr. Pembroke instructed, his voice low, almost swallowed by the quiet of the room. He positioned the stethoscope carefully against her chest, the cold metal sending a faint shiver through her. He closed his eyes, listening intently. Each faint rasp and flutter of air, a declaration of the disease's progression. The verdict arrived not in words, but in sound. A crackling beneath the lungs, subtle yet insistent. A pause between inhalation and exhalation that spoke louder than any report, louder than any chart or ledger could record. Dr. Pembroke's breath caught in his throat. He had seen this pattern before, traced it in countless homes, hospitals, and workhouses. It was a sound that heralded both fragility and inevitability. Eleanor's mother hovered nearby, hands clasped tightly, knuckles pale. Her eyes flicked from her daughter's face to the doctor, searching for reassurance, for a signal that all would be well. But the physician remained silent, listening, each moment stretched, taut and fragile, until even the distant fog seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Finally, he removed the stethoscope, setting it gently upon the bedside table. The faint echo of the metal against porcelain seemed to reverberate through the room like a heartbeat measured against despair. "I hear what I feared," he said quietly, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood the fragility of hope. "Her lungs, they are weakened. The disease has progressed beyond the earliest stage. There is no immediate cure. We can ease her suffering, sustain her strength, but the illness itself is relentless." Mrs. Harbury's lips trembled. She pressed her hand to her mouth, as if the mere act of breathing might carry the weight of his words into the air, into her body, into her very soul. Her eyes filled with tears, and she pressed them quickly back, unwilling to let them fall, unwilling to acknowledge fully the quiet verdict that had just been delivered. Eleanor stirred slightly, her pale lips forming a faint smile. "I understand," she whispered, her voice frail but steady. "Do what you can." Dr. Pembroke nodded, though the ache in his chest mirrored the sorrow in the room. He began to prepare a regimen of small tonics, of gentle encouragement, of careful measures to prolong comfort. Medicine could not reclaim what the disease had claimed. It could only offer fragile moments of reprieve, brief as the flicker of a candle flame in the vast darkness of night. The stethoscope rested on the table, a silent witness to what had been heard and understood. It spoke of frailty, of inevitability, and of the delicate dance between life and the patient, measured one shallow breath at a time. Outside, the fog pressed tighter against the sanatorium walls, as though listening to the verdict that had just been rendered within. Inside, Eleanor drew a faint, steadying breath, her small hand resting lightly on her mother's. And in that quiet room, the truth hung as heavily as the winter air. The white death would not be rushed, would not be moved, and would mark its course quietly, inexorably, through every fragile chest it touched. In a townhouse on the north side of Mayfair, Mr. Edward Fairchild sat rigidly in his armchair, hands folded neatly across his waistcoat. The fire in the hearth cast a warm, trembling light across the polished floorboards, illuminating the brass fittings on the mantel and the delicate porcelain figurines arranged with fastidious care. Yet beneath the veneer of comfort and propriety, a quiet terror festered a weight Edward carried in every breath he drew. For weeks he had felt the subtle encroachment of illness. A cough that he first dismissed as a chill, a fleeting irritation, had become persistent, sharp, and inescapable. But he did not allow it to show. To do so would be to betray his strength, his standing, his very dignity. Victorian gentlemen were expected to endure silently, to maintain composure in the face of adversity, and Edward adhered to these expectations with meticulous precision. Each cough was muffled into the palm of his hand, each wheeze suppressed behind the thick folds of a handkerchief. He sat among visiting friends, nodding politely, raising glasses to conversation, and smiling faintly when complimented on his demeanor, all the while counting breaths as though each one were borrowed. The effort was exhausting, yet to reveal weakness was to invite pity, speculation, and the cold judgment of a society obsessed with appearances. His valet, a quiet man named Thompson, moved about the room with unobtrusive efficiency, setting tea and straightening papers. He had noticed the slight pallor that had begun to haunt Mr. Fairchild's cheeks, the subtle tremor in his hands, the occasional catch in his breath. But Edward's pride was such that no hint of his struggle would be acknowledged, even to one who had attended him for years. At precisely 4 o'clock, the doctor arrived. Dr. Pembroke himself, summoned under the guise of routine consultation. He observed Edward carefully, noting the way his chest rose and fell unevenly, the faint sheen of sweat that betrayed the effort of each inhalation. "Sir," he said gently, "there is no need to conceal your discomfort. We must attend to it." Edward's fingers tightened around the edge of his chair. "I assure you, doctor, it is nothing. A mere chill," he said, though his voice betrayed the strain of suppressed coughing. Dr. Pembroke inclined his head. "Very well," he said cautiously, "but do not mistake propriety for health. This cough you hide, it signals more than a chill. Your lungs bear the mark of early consumption." Edward's heart clenched, but his face remained carefully neutral. He knew the social implications of illness. A gentleman seen to falter, to require assistance, could quickly lose standing, influence, and opportunity. Even in the face of death, one's reputation demanded preservation. He rose from his chair, moving toward the window with a stiff grace. Outside, London lay muffled beneath morning fog, its streets slick with frost and coal dust. The city moved on, indifferent to his suffering, unaware of the silent struggle unfolding within its walls. He pressed the handkerchief to his lips again, drawing in a slow, deliberate breath, as though the act of restraint might stave off the inevitable. Dr. Pembroke followed him, speaking softly of care and regimen, of tonics and rest. But Edward listened only in part, nodding politely. He returned to the chair, lifting the cup of tea the valet had prepared, and sipped slowly, deliberately, as if the very act of drinking might restore him. Yet he knew it would not. The cough remained, persistent and patient, as inexorable as the fog that pressed upon London's streets. And in that quiet, well-appointed room, Edward Fairchild understood the cruel paradox of Victorian life. A gentleman must preserve appearances even as death crept silently, quietly, inexorably through his very lungs. The fire flickered, the shadows danced, and the cough, muffled and disciplined, continued to echo faintly, a reminder that the White Death required no invitation, no announcement, only the patient endurance of those it claimed. The dawn was grey and cold, heavy with mist that clung stubbornly to the cobblestones of Wellington Row. Even the sun, reluctant and pale, seemed hesitant to rise fully, as if the day itself mourned. The city had yet to awaken, save for the distant rumble of a carriage and the occasional cry of a market hawker. Yet, in front of the Harbury residence, an unmistakable procession unfolded, slow and deliberate, a quiet testament to grief that could not be ignored. Eleanor's bed had remained empty through the night, her illness having claimed her fragile body with merciless precision. The curtains fluttered in the faint breeze from the open window, though now no one needed to draw strength from the cold air. The room was hollow without her breath. Inside, the faint traces of perfume, of laundered linens, and of tonic lingered like ghosts, reminders of life that had slipped quietly from the household's grasp. Outside, the procession wound its way through the fog-laden street. Pallbearers, stiff in their black coats, bore the small coffin with meticulous care. The soft thud of boots against frozen earth and the muted scrape of wheels against cobblestones echoed faintly, carrying the weight of sorrow into every corner. Mourners followed in subdued clusters, their faces drawn and pale, shrouded in scarves and veils, each step measured as if by ritual. Mrs. Harbury walked at the forefront, her hands gloved and clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on the coffin as though her gaze could tether it to the world of the living. Henry walked beside her, small and silent, his usual vivacity flattened beneath the oppressive weight of grief. Each breath he took seemed hesitant, each step careful, as if the world itself had grown treacherous beneath his feet. Neighbors lined the street, quietly observing the passing of a family caught in the relentless grip of tuberculosis. The disease had spared no house, no rank, no child. Its path was indiscriminate, patient, and cruel. Whispers followed the procession, another one, taken too soon. So quiet, so sudden. The words were cautious, respectful, but the dread underlying them was unmistakable. The coffin passed beneath the misty gas lamps, their light glinting against polished handles, flickering against the mourner's downcast eyes. The small size of the coffin, proportioned for a child, struck a raw, unrelenting chord in every heart. Even seasoned mourners, accustomed to the city's quiet losses, felt the hush settle deep within their chests. At the gravesite, the earth had been prepared hours before, churned dark and damp beneath the frost. A solitary priest, face pale and lined, read the brief prayers with careful solemnity, his voice carrying faintly over the damp soil and into the chill morning air. The pallbearers lowered the coffin slowly, deliberately, each inch a final testament to the fragility of life in a city haunted by the White Death. Mrs. Harbury placed a hand over her heart, tears spilling silently beneath her veil. Henry clutched at her skirts, eyes wide and shimmering, the first stark awareness of mortality settling heavily upon him. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, of frost, and of flowers pressed carefully into the soil, desperate attempts to soften the starkness of reality. As the first weak rays of sun touched the head of the grave, a hush lingered over the scene. The city, still cloaked in morning mist, seemed to exhale a mournful breath alongside them. Life continued beyond the street, in carriage and market and distant footfall. But here, in this moment, time had slowed. The funeral procession, simple yet unyielding, marked not only the passing of a single child but the quiet toll of a disease that had crept unseen into countless homes. And as the mourners dispersed, their footsteps leaving faint impressions in the frost, the Harburys remained for a moment longer, standing beside the grave. The White Death had claimed another life, leaving behind only echoes of laughter, glimpses of childhood, and the fragile memory of a breath that would never again stir the air of Victorian London. The night had fallen early over Wellington Row, and with it came a darkness that pressed heavy against the walls of the Harbury household. In Eleanor's room, the flickering glow of a single lamp cast wavering shadows along the wallpaper, turning familiar patterns into strange, shifting shapes. The air smelled faintly of lavender and tonic, yet it was tinged with something sharper, the acrid, iron-tinged scent that accompanied fevered breath. Mrs. Harbury sat beside the narrow bed, her body coiled beneath blankets that had been haphazardly layered in the night. Her hands rested upon her daughter's chest, feeling the shallow, uneven rise and fall of each fragile breath. She had refused to leave the room since dusk, knowing that any absence, however brief, might allow the White Death to claim its silent victory more swiftly. Sleep was impossible. It had become a luxury too dangerous to indulge. Eleanor stirred, her hand reaching weakly for her mother's, fingers trembling against the warmth of her own. The cough had returned, harsh and insistent, punctuating the quiet like a tolling bell. Mrs. Harbury pressed a cloth to her lips and listened, the sound scraping against her ears, embedding itself in her chest, a reminder of the fragility that defined every hour. "My darling," she whispered, smoothing the damp hair from Eleanor's forehead. "Rest now. Let me breathe with you, if you must." Eleanor tried to comply, her eyes fluttering closed, yet the subtle agitation in her chest betrayed the discomfort that no amount of tonic, blanket, or reassurance could fully abate. Mrs. Harbury remained vigilant, adjusting the pillows, tucking the blankets closer, murmuring gentle encouragements. Each movement was precise, deliberate, as though one careless gesture might shift the fragile balance between life and death. The room, though small, seemed to swell with the weight of their presence. Shadows stretched and bent along the walls, the lamp's faint glow flickering against the ceiling. Every breath Eleanor took was amplified in the stillness, a rhythm that became both a measure of survival and a mark of inevitability. Outside, London slept beneath a blanket of fog, muffling the distant sounds of carriages and early morning labourers. Yet in this small, enclosed space, the city's pulse was palpable. The wind pressed against the window panes, stirring the curtains in soft, ghostly waves, and carrying with it the faint tang of coal smoke and frost. Within, Mrs. Harbury's vigil was absolute. She could not permit herself to relax, could not permit her own exhaustion to dull her attention. Hours passed in quiet torment. Eleanor's cough softened but did not vanish, her small body trembling with each laboured inhalation. Her mother's hand never left hers, tracing the fragile contours of her daughter's wrist, noting the flutter of pulse beneath the skin. The room seemed suspended in time, the lamp flickering as though it too recognized the fragility of the moment. At one point, Eleanor murmured faintly, words almost lost in the thick air, "Mama, will you stay?" Mrs. Harbury pressed a kiss to the crown of her daughter's head. "Always, my darling," she whispered. "Always." As the night deepened, the mother and daughter remained entwined in vigil. Sleep had been abandoned, but in its absence came a different kind of communion, a shared endurance, a quiet defiance against the merciless progress of the disease. Outside, the fog clung heavier to the city, muffling its bustling life. Yet inside this small room, the rhythm of breath, the warmth of a mother's hand, and the fragile pulse of a child's chest became the only measure of survival. By dawn, pale light would filter once more through the window, touching their faces and revealing the toll of the vigil. Yet even as exhaustion weighed upon Mrs. Harbury, she would not move, for to leave would be to betray the delicate line between life and the encroaching shadow of the White Death. And so she stayed, breathing in time with her child, a guardian against the night, against fear, against the inevitability that awaited beyond the fragile linens and flickering lamp. The fog that morning lay thick over Wellington Row, curling between buildings and seeping into every crack in the narrow streets. It pressed against doors and windows, muffling the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the faint calls of early vendors. The city seemed to hold its breath, each inhalation slow and careful, as if wary of disturbing something unseen, yet omnipresent. The illness that had crept into countless homes had become a quiet, collective weight upon the neighborhood, settling into the air with a presence that could be felt more than seen. From one end of the street to the other, the shutters of houses remained closed, the usual bustle of morning errands and errands delayed. The baker's door, usually ajar to welcome the first customers with the scent of fresh bread, stayed closed. Even the milkman lingered at the corner, hesitant to continue his rounds in the presence of so many fragile lives. Children's voices, which once bounced along the cobblestones with laughter and mischief, were absent. The few who ventured into the mist did so quietly, their small forms hunched against the cold, faces pale beneath scarves and caps, aware even at their tender age that death walked silently among them. Inside the Harbury home, Eleanor lay propped against pillows, the faint sheen of fever upon her cheeks illuminated by the pale light that filtered through the narrow cracks of the shutters. Her breath came in shallow, uneven waves, the soft rattle in her chest audible even in the hushed stillness of the house. Mrs. Harbury hovered beside her, fingers intertwined over the girl's hand, eyes fixed on each subtle movement, each faint exhale. Even the servants moved like shadows, gliding silently across the polished floorboards, careful not to stir the air in ways that might betray the presence of illness. Across the street, the tenement windows reflected the fog like dull mirrors, the curtains drawn tightly to keep both warmth and hope within. In those upper rooms, families watched and waited, listening for coughs or stirrings from neighbors, counting the hours as if each one held a fragile promise or a threat. Workhouses and smaller homes carried the same weight. The city's hum had softened into a low, collective murmur, the heartbeat of London slowed by fear, by grief, by illness that refused to be named aloud. A carriage creaked along the cobblestones, its wheels muffled by frost, but even the driver spoke in hushed tones, as though loud words might wake the invisible spectre that had claimed so many. The fog seemed to gather in the spaces between buildings, curling like smoke from invisible chimneys, wrapping the street in a cloak of anticipation and unease. Eleanor stirred faintly, her hand rising to press against her chest, and Mrs. Harbury leaned closer, whispering encouragements that felt small against the enormity of what surrounded them. A distant cough punctuated the silence, carrying from some unseen window down the row, a reminder that the White Death was not confined to a single home. It was patient, invisible, relentless. By midday, Wellington Row remained unmoving. The silence was not merely the absence of sound, it was a presence itself, heavy and oppressive, pressing upon the living as though demanding their attention, their acknowledgement of the fragile lives it enveloped. Even those outside the immediate reach of illness felt its weight, adjusting their movements, their voices, their very breath in deference to an invisible master. And as the fog clung heavier still, drifting across doorsteps and between walls, the neighborhood understood silently, collectively, irrevocably that the city had changed. Every home, every family, every child was caught in the quiet tension between survival and surrender. The street itself seemed to breathe along with the living and the dying, wrapped in the inescapable, watchful silence of Victorian London under the shadow of the White Death. In a quiet laboratory on the outskirts of Bloomsbury, the air smelled of carbolic, alcohol, and the faint tang of powdered minerals. The fog outside pressed against the tall windows, dulling the weak morning light, yet inside it was alive with the concentrated energy of inquiry. Dr. Lionel Whitcomb, a scientist of meticulous habits and an unyielding mind, peered through the brass and glass of his microscope. The slide beneath the lens bore a tiny sample of lung tissue, taken with careful hands from a patient recently admitted to the city hospital. The specimen was almost imperceptible at first, pale and unremarkable against the clean glass. Yet Whitcomb knew how to read the language hidden in subtle marks, in the delicate patterns etched by illness into the very flesh. He adjusted the fine focus with slow, deliberate turns, the clicking of the mechanism echoing softly through the otherwise hushed room. Through the lens, the world transformed. Tiny filaments, faint and twisting, appeared to him like ghostly fingers reaching through the tissue. They moved with quiet intent, indifferent to human observation or concern. Whitcomb's heart quickened not with alarm, for he had expected this, but with the solemn thrill of revelation. He recognized the marks immediately, the tuberculosis, the minute architect of suffering that had woven its way into homes, workhouses, and sanatoria across London. He leaned back, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. The city itself seemed to press against the window panes, fog curling in like the breath of the dying. Whitcomb thought of the families he had visited, the mothers clutching children with fevered hands, the fathers standing rigid as statues of despair, the nurses who refused sleep as the White Death advanced quietly among the living. He opened a notebook and began to draw, careful lines tracing the filaments as they appeared beneath the lens. Each mark was both a discovery and a condemnation, a microscopic witness to the relentless march of disease. "It spreads with patience," he murmured to himself, "through air, through touch, through the milk of cows, unsuspecting of its cruelty. It does not rest, it does not forgive." A faint knock at the door drew him from his reverie. A young assistant entered, carrying a small tray of slides, each labelled with care. "Sir, the samples from Hampstead Hill," he whispered. "Shall I prepare them for examination?" Whitcomb nodded, his fingers already moving to take the first tray. "We must understand its manner of attack," he said quietly. "Only through knowledge may we hope to intervene, however slightly. Do not forget, every sample is a story of life and loss, a record of the city's silent suffering." He set the slides under the lens, one by one, observing the faint, twisting shapes, marking notes, drawing connections. The hours passed with the quiet insistence of a metronome. Outside, the fog lingered, muffling the distant hum of London streets. Within, Whitcomb worked tirelessly, translating the invisible language of disease into diagrams, calculations, and careful words. By late afternoon, the small room smelled strongly of alcohol and faint smoke from a lamp wick, and the scientist's hands bore traces of powdered reagents, yet his eyes remained sharp, unblinking, scanning every curve, every filament. In that quiet laboratory, amid glass slides and brass instruments, he had glimpsed the architecture of suffering, and in that glimpse lay both dread and determination. The city's White Death could not be stopped by prayer or precaution alone. It could only be understood, studied, traced, and documented, its every movement mapped with careful hands and keen eyes. Whitcomb pressed the final notes into his notebook, the weight of knowledge heavy upon him. The fog pressed closer against the glass, yet inside he felt a fragile sense of purpose, that through observation, through study perhaps, the tide of suffering could one day be slowed, if not halted entirely. And as the lamp flickered against the wall, he knew the work would continue long after the city slept, in silence, beneath the relentless shadow of the White Death. The laboratory was still, save for the faint scratch of a pen across paper and the soft ticking of a clock that measured time in deliberate, unyielding increments. Dr. Lionel Whitcomb leaned over his microscope, adjusting the focus with meticulous care. the brass gleaming faintly in the pale morning light that seeped through the tall, narrow windows. The fog outside had lifted only slightly, revealing rooftops slick with frost, but inside, the air carried its own chill. The sterile, carbolic scent of long hours spent in observation, and the faint, lingering odor of death that clung to every tissue sample. The slide beneath the lens held a piece of lung tissue taken from a child recently admitted to a Hampstead Hill sanatorium. Whitcomb had prepared countless slides before, had observed cell structures, ailments, and the ravages of disease. Yet today, as he adjusted the fine focus, the patterns beneath the glass revealed something different. Subtle, twisting, and insistent, tiny bacilli moved with an almost imperceptible animation, like filaments of smoke curling in a shaft of light. They were delicate, yet unmistakably present, a silent architecture of suffering. Whitcomb's heart quickened not in alarm, but in recognition. He leaned closer, his breath fogging slightly against the cool glass of the microscope. He sketched rapidly in his notebook, the lines precise, capturing the movements and structure of what he now understood. The tubercle bacillus, the agent of the disease that had haunted London's streets, workhouses, and homes for generations. The realization hit him fully. This was no ordinary illness. This was a microscopic predator, patient, deliberate, and relentless, moving unseen from lungs to lungs, leaving the pallor of fever and the rattle of breath in its wake. He paused, removing his spectacles, and rubbed his eyes. The weight of the discovery pressed upon him. This knowledge, once fully confirmed and understood, could transform the treatment of the illness that had claimed countless children, mothers, fathers, and servants alike. It offered a path toward understanding, toward containment, toward hope. But it also carried the burden of inevitability. The disease had already claimed so many, and the city, unaware, continued in its fragile routines, oblivious to the silent devastation that coursed beneath its fog and coal smoke. A knock at the door drew Whitcomb from his study. His assistant entered, carrying a tray of additional slides, each labeled with care and precision. "Sir," he said quietly, "the samples from St. Bartholomew's. Shall I prepare them for observation?" Whitcomb nodded, his mind already racing. "Yes, every sample must be examined. Compare these to the previous findings. We must understand its structure, its manner of propagation, its weaknesses, if any exist." His voice was steady, though the weight of urgency threaded through it. Hours passed in quiet concentration. Whitcomb moved from slide to slide, recording notes, sketching patterns, and cross-referencing observations with his growing collection of data. Outside, the city seemed suspended in fog, silent, the streets empty, save for the occasional distant sound of a carriage. Inside, the lab was alive with the meticulous hum of study, the faint scratch of pencil on paper, the soft murmurs of observation. At last, Whitcomb set down his pen and leaned back. The significance of his discovery was undeniable. He had traced the microscopic agent of tuberculosis with clarity, mapped its presence in lung tissue, and documented its insidious reach. This knowledge, he knew, would change the way physicians approached the disease, the way sanatoriums were organized, the way the city understood the invisible threat that had haunted it for generations. Yet, as he gazed out through the frost-laden windows at the quiet city below, he could not ignore the human cost already exacted. Houses were empty of children, mothers, and fathers. Streets were hushed, shadows stretched long, and the White Death moved with patient inevitability. The discovery might offer hope for the future, but it could not undo the suffering already written into London's fog and stone. Whitcomb closed his notebook with deliberate care. Knowledge had been gained, understanding had been won, and in the quiet of the laboratory, he understood fully that the battle against the disease was only just beginning. The halls of Westminster were unusually still that morning, the murmur of footsteps and rustle of papers muted by the weight of anticipation. The Public Health Act had been drafted in haste, yet deliberation, a document intended to confront the invisible threat that had crept through London with patient inevitability. For months, ministers and physicians had presented their reports, urging action, citing the toll of tuberculosis upon the city's children, the poor, and the unsuspecting middle class alike. And yet, the act was met not with universal relief, but with suspicion, reluctance, and thinly veiled indignation. Sir Reginald Hartley, the bill's chief proponent, rose at the appointed hour, his hands gripping the polished edge of the parliamentary desk. His voice carried through the chamber, crisp and measured, though threaded with a tension he could not fully disguise. "Gentlemen," he began, "we face a threat unseen yet deadly. Families collapse beneath its weight, workhouses overflow with the sick, and our streets echo with the coughs of the afflicted. This act is no mere regulation. It is a necessity, a measure to safeguard the living, to shield the vulnerable, and to confront a disease that has evaded our notice for far too long." A ripple of murmurs responded, polite but skeptical. Some members leaned forward, attentive to his words. Others shifted uneasily in their seats, frowning at the implications. To acknowledge the White Death meant acknowledging the city's failures, its overcrowded tenements, its polluted water, its indifference to the suffering of the poor. And many in Parliament were loath to admit culpability, preferring instead to debate the minutiae of implementation, the cost, the logistics. Lord Pembroke rose, his voice formal and measured, though edged with clear unease. "Sir," he said, "I do not dispute the severity of the disease, but this act imposes great burdens upon the citizens. Forced inspections, mandatory sanitation, restrictions upon trade and habitation, these measures are heavy, and many will perceive them as intrusion upon liberty." Sir Hartley's brow furrowed. "Liberty," he replied firmly, "is of little worth to those who cannot breathe, to those whose children lie in fevered beds. We are not restricting freedom without cause. We are preserving life." The debate stretched for hours, voices rising and falling like the tide against the Thames. Arguments ranged from practical to philosophical, from fiscal concern to moral principle. Some contended that the poor were responsible for their own suffering, their habits and environments inviting disease. Others spoke with trembling urgency of overcrowded workhouses, of families forced to share a single room with coughing children, of mothers who watched helplessly as their young ones faded. Meanwhile, the fog outside the Parliament pressed against the city, curling into alleys and courtyards, muffling the distant clang of carriages and the shouts of early market vendors. London held its breath in quiet anticipation, unaware that its very governance struggled with the necessity of acknowledging the invisible killer that moved among its citizens. By afternoon, the chamber had grown heavy with tension. Sir Hartley's words echoed in the minds of the assembly, families dying silently, neighbourhoods succumbing quietly, the White Death advancing with inexorable patience. Yet resistance persisted. Debate continued, a delicate dance between the impulse to act and the reluctance to accept responsibility. In the Harbury household, Eleanor lay in her narrow bed, the pale morning sun touching her fevered cheeks. The city beyond the fog remained ignorant of her struggle, unaware that legislation now limped through Parliament, grappling with the disease she bore in silence. Mrs. Harbury pressed her hand to her daughter's forehead, feeling the fragile rise and fall of her chest, knowing that even the strongest law could not alter the patient and merciless course of consumption. And as the fog deepened once more, curling through the streets and alleys of London, it seemed to swallow the city's deliberations, leaving only the quiet, relentless truth. The White Death required recognition, action, and vigilance, and no act of governance could undo the suffering already etched into its streets. The hospital on Highgate Hill, stood austere against the pale morning sky, its stone facade cold and unyielding, yet etched with a solemn purpose. Across the wrought-iron gate, a small banner had been unfurled, its lettering painstakingly embroidered and bold. Sanatorium for the consumptive, admission open to all in need. The cloth flapped faintly in the wind, carrying the message into the fog-laden street, an announcement both practical and desperate. Within the walls, the White Death, relentless, patient, invisible, claimed its victims with quiet efficiency, leaving families helpless, breathless, and silent. Dr. Lionel Whitcomb arrived just as the morning mist began to lift, his coat drawn tight against the cold. He paused at the gate, noting the banner's sway, and the small cluster of anxious faces gathered beneath it. Mothers clutched children to their chests, pale and thin, their eyes wide with fear. Fathers stood rigid, hands clenched, masks of stoicism barely concealing the dread gnawing at their insides. The sanatorium, though a sanctuary, was also a stark reminder. The disease did not relent for wealth, for status, or for hope. It moved silently, weaving between households, leaving behind the echo of coughs, the shimmer of fevered skin, and the hollows of grief. Inside the ward, the smell of carbolic and antiseptic clung to the air, mingling faintly with the subtle sweetness of herbs and tonics meant to comfort. Nurse Margaret Fenwick moved among the beds with careful precision, her hands adjusting blankets, smoothing damp hair, offering water, whispering reassurances that carried both solace and inevitability. Each patient, young and old alike, lay frail beneath the thick blankets, their breaths shallow and measured. The faint rattle in the lungs, the subtle flush of cheeks, the delicate tremor in fingers and lips, all spoke of the disease's silent authority. Dr. Whitcomb surveyed the room, noting each case with meticulous care. He observed a boy no older than Henry Harbury, curled beneath a quilt, his tiny body trembling with fever. A mother hovered near, her face drawn and weary, whispering encouragements that seemed too small for the enormity of the struggle. He moved to a cot near the window, where a young girl lay with eyes half closed, clutching a handkerchief to her lips. Her breath was shallow, her cough intermittent but persistent. Whitcomb leaned closer, listening with his trained ear, noting every subtle rattle, every irregularity. From the courtyard outside, the banner flapped again, a small signal of hope to those who had travelled far, who had waited in fog-laden streets, uncertain whether aid or despair would greet them. Yet the symbol could not erase the fear that lingered in every heart within the walls. Families had left homes already touched by illness. Sometimes bringing more than relief, the bacillus had a way of travelling silently, passing unnoticed from one fragile lung to another. By midday, the ward was alive with quiet movement. Nurses tending, physicians observing, patients struggling against fever and fatigue. Yet the banner outside remained a silent sentinel, flapping against the chill wind, proclaiming aid where it could be offered, hope where it could be extended, and vigilance against the invisible enemy lurking in London's fog. Dr. Whitcomb paused beside the young girl's cot, brushing a damp lock from her forehead. "You are safe here for now," he murmured, though the words carried a weight of careful honesty. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the slow march of the White Death. Within the walls, the banner above the gate stood as both promise and warning. Aid was offered, but vigilance was eternal, for tuberculosis would not relent, and the city's fragile children and weary parents relied upon those who kept watch within. The wind lifted slightly, carrying the banner's words down the hill, across the frost-slicked streets, a quiet testament to hope, endurance, and the relentless necessity of care against an invisible, merciless adversary. The chimneys of East London rose like blackened fingers against the pale winter sky, exhaling plumes of soot and smoke that clung to every surface, every garment, every breath. Within the narrow confines of the textile factories, the air was thick with cotton fibers, coal dust, and the acrid tang of chemical dyes. The young women who worked these looms moved with mechanical precision, fingers nimble and pale, lungs straining against the suffocating mixture of winter frost and industrial fumes. Many were already weakened by the silent, relentless hand of consumption, and each day, each breath, became a negotiation with inevitability. Margaret Ellison, a girl of barely 17, leaned against her workbench, wiping the sweat from her fevered brow. Her cough had grown persistent over the past week, rattling softly in her chest, yet she continued her tasks as though the rhythm of the looms might somehow ward off the encroaching illness. Around her, the other girls moved similarly, pale faces illuminated only by the dim gaslights that flickered uncertainly above their heads. The air was heavy, unyielding, and suffused with the same threat that had long haunted London's tenements and workhouses. One by one, the girls began to falter under the weight of smoke and disease. Fingers slowed, breaths grew shallow, and coughs echoed through the narrow rows, drawing fearful glances from overseers who, accustomed to the hum of production, now looked upon these signs with thinly veiled anxiety. It was then that Margaret, her own lungs burning, took a quiet, determined step back from her station. She straightened her posture and raised her voice, a soft, trembling sound, but one that carried clearly across the factory floor. "We cannot work like this," she exclaimed. "The air we breathe is killing us." Heads turned, supervisors paused, unsure whether to rebuke or listen. The other girls, emboldened by her courage, nodded in agreement, some speaking aloud for the first time in days. "We cannot continue. Our lungs will fail. We deserve air to breathe." The sound of defiance, though modest in volume, carried weight. It was the collective voice of the afflicted, of those whose strength had been eroded by industry and illness alike. Slowly, cautiously, more girls stepped back, ceasing their work in unison. The looms, which had hummed continuously for hours, fell silent, their clattering reduced to faint echoes in the high-ceilinged factory. An overseer approached, his face tight with concern and frustration. "Girls, you cannot halt production." Margaret met his gaze steadily, cough rattling faintly in her chest. "We cannot continue to breathe this air," she said. "It will kill us, faster than the looms ever could. We demand clean air, or we will not work." Word spread quickly. Other factory floors echoed with similar protests, young women stepping back, demanding ventilation, windows thrown open to allow the chill winter air to sweep through the buildings, hoping the clean gusts might carry away the invisible spectre that lingered in each breath. The city's industrial heart, normally indifferent to suffering, was forced to recognize the quiet insurrection of the vulnerable. By mid-morning, letters had been dispatched to factory owners, petitions prepared, and whispers of advocacy passed from street to street. The White Death, patient and indifferent, lingered still in the fog outside. But within the walls of these factories, young women had claimed a small measure of defiance. Clean air, even if imperfect, had become their shield, however temporary, against the relentless advance of tuberculosis. And as the first shafts of sunlight pierced the soot-laden windows, glimmering on the pale faces of the striking girls, the city seemed momentarily aware that even the weakest might demand to breathe, and in that awareness, a fragile, determined hope flickered, tenuous as the morning light. The streets of London had begun to carry whispers of suspicion, though the fog still rolled in thick from the Thames, muting the distant clatter of carts and the faint cries of market vendors. In the narrow alleyways of the city, mothers clutched children close to their chests, eyeing the milk delivered to their homes with newfound caution. A simple sustenance, once trusted without question, had become a potential vector for the relentless spectre of consumption. The White Death, patient and invisible, moved in the hidden spaces of life, entering homes through the most intimate of channels, the milk that nourished the young. It was into this climate of quiet fear that the milk reformers stepped, a small, determined group of physicians, public health officers, and philanthropists who had begun to advocate for inspection, pasteurization, and regulation. Their cause was urgent, though met with skepticism, ridicule, and the faint hostility of a society unwilling to admit the fragility of its systems. The reformers moved from parish to parish, raising their voices in lecture halls, distributing pamphlets, and knocking on the doors of apothecaries and dairy suppliers alike. Dr. Whitcomb, increasingly absorbed in the microscopic study of tuberculosis, had lent his authority to the cause. He travelled alongside reformers to inspect dairies, noting with precise calculation the sources of milk and the practices of delivery. Many were careless. Cattle penned in damp stables, water stagnant and foul, milk stored in containers insufficiently cleansed. The very process of nourishment became a conduit for death. One afternoon, Dr. Whitcomb arrived at a small urban dairy, the fog curling in through the low doorway, dampening the straw that littered the floor. Cows, huddled in a narrow pen, shifted uncomfortably, their breaths rising in small clouds against the cold. The milkmen moved about with brisk efficiency, unaware of the danger they carried. Whitcomb inspected the containers, noting residue clinging to rims, the faint odor of stale liquid, and the temperature at which the milk had been stored. "This cannot continue," he said firmly, addressing the small assembly of milkmen and suppliers. "The city's children are dying. This milk, if not inspected, if not treated, carries with it the invisible threat of tuberculosis. Pasteurization, cleanliness, vigilance, these are not optional. They are life or death." The men shifted uneasily, some defensive, others curious. Change was inconvenient, expensive, and an affront to long-held routines. Yet Whitcomb's insistence, coupled with the quiet authority he carried from his work with the afflicted, lent weight to their words. Across the city, reformers posted notices in parish halls and apothecaries, urging families to demand safe milk, to question its sources, to reject complacency. Mothers carried these instructions home, reading aloud to children who clutched blankets, whose small bodies had already begun to show the subtle signs of illness. The streets themselves seemed to lean closer, fog wrapping around lamplights like a cloak, listening to the murmurs of advocacy and fear. Even within the sanatoria, nurses and attendants took note of the reforms, adjusting protocols to ensure that the milk they administered to their fragile charges was clean, heated, and safe. Every measure, however small, offered a fleeting resistance to the patient march of the White Death. By evening, the city's fog had thickened once more, hiding rooftops and chimneys beneath a pale grey veil. Yet within homes, in small kitchens and nursery rooms, the message of vigilance against contamination had begun to take root. The milk reformers' crusade, though only partially understood by a public resistant to change, had introduced a measure of defense, a promise that even as tuberculosis prowled invisibly, human action could slow its relentless advance. And in the quiet streets of London, where the smell of coal mingled with the faint tang of fear, the city learned slowly, grudgingly, that even nourishment could betray life, and only vigilance, care, and reform could shield those who were too fragile to defend themselves. The first pale light of spring crept slowly across Wellington Row, softening the frost that had clung stubbornly to doorsteps and window ledges for weeks. For the Harbury household, the dawn carried a fragile promise, a reprieve, however tenuous, from the relentless suffocation of winter and the shadow of the White Death that had lingered so long within their walls. Eleanor, though still pale and delicate, drew breaths that were deeper, less laboured, and her cough had begun to ease with the regimen of fresh air, tonic, and the gentle vigilance of those who loved her. Mrs. Harbury sat beside her daughter, fingers lightly resting on her hand, feeling the subtle rise and fall of her chest. Each breath was a small miracle, each exhale a gentle victory against the disease that had threatened to claim her. Henry hovered nearby, his eyes bright despite the pallor that had settled over him during the long months of illness. He carried a small bundle of flowers, carefully gathered from the window boxes that had survived the frost, and placed them gently on the bedside table. The scent of lavender and early blooms mingled faintly with the lingering traces of carbolic from the previous night's cleaning, creating a delicate balance between illness and renewal. Dr. Pembroke entered quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick rugs in the corridor. He had come to assess Eleanor, to ensure that the slow improvement was not illusory. His eyes, though attentive, bore a rare warmth as he approached the bed. "You are breathing more steadily," he remarked, his voice soft yet precise. "Your lungs respond to the air and care you have received. It is not a cure, but it is progress." Eleanor smiled faintly, her lips tinged with the color of health for the first time in many weeks. "I feel lighter," she murmured, a whisper that carried both relief and disbelief. The family moved cautiously, aware that hope, like fragile glass, could shatter if handled carelessly. Mrs. Harbury adjusted the pillows beneath Eleanor's head, smoothing the blankets around her slight frame. "We must continue the regimen," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. "The fresh air, the rest, the tonic. You must allow your strength to return slowly." Henry perched on a small chair beside the bed, fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. "Does this mean she will get better?" he asked, his voice trembling with the cautious optimism of a child who had seen too much fear. Dr. Pembroke smiled faintly. "Better," he replied. "Better. If care and patience are maintained, the disease is still present, but we are learning to counter it with vigilance and measured attention. The lungs are beginning to reclaim their rhythm." Outside, the city seemed to exhale, fog lifting slowly from the streets and alleyways. The chimneys still smoked, and the distant clang of industry persisted. But for once, the oppressive weight of winter's illness seemed less pressing. In homes and tenements nearby, families moved with tentative hope, some aware of recovery, others simply sensing a quiet shift in the air. Within the Harbury home, Eleanor drew a deeper breath, feeling the chest expand with effort and promise. Mrs. Harbury's fingers pressed lightly against her wrist, counting the pulse and noting the steady rhythm. Henry adjusted the small vase of flowers, watching their petals sway gently in the morning light. For the first time in weeks, the household felt a measure of normalcy, not complete, not unshakable, but tangible enough to inspire courage. A family, once bound by fear and the oppressive shadow of tuberculosis, had begun to learn again the simple act of breathing freely. And as the sun rose higher, spilling gold across the floorboards and warming the fragile faces of mother, father, and child, the Harburys understood a quiet truth. In vigilance, care, and patience, life could persist even beneath the shadow of the White Death, and hope, delicate, fragile, and bright, could begin to take root once more. The winter's frost had begun to yield to the pale hints of spring, yet a chill still lingered in the streets of Wellington Row, pressing against doors and windows with a damp insistence. Dr. Alistair Pembroke adjusted the collar of his coat as he stepped from his carriage, boots clicking softly against the frost-glazed cobblestones. The fog had lifted enough to reveal the grey facades of neighbouring townhouses, their shutters drawn tight, but the air remained heavy with the memory of nights spent listening to coughs, sighs, and the quiet, unspoken terror of the consumptive. He carried with him a small black case, polished and well-worn, its brass fittings gleaming faintly in the morning light. Inside lay the instruments of his profession: the stethoscope, carefully cleaned and oiled, glass vials for tonics, and a collection of powders and ointments meant to soothe, strengthen, and sustain. Each tool was imbued with purpose, yet none could undo the patient, inexorable work of the White Death. Upon entering the Harbury home, he was greeted by the familiar hush of a household that had learned to move quietly around illness. The servants had gone about their early tasks with subdued efficiency, their eyes flicking toward the bedrooms with faint anxiety. Mrs. Harbury emerged from Eleanor's room, her hands clasped together, the worry lines upon her face softened only by the fragile hope that had begun to take root with the first signs of improvement. Dr. Pembroke entered the room, greeted Eleanor with a gentle nod, and immediately set to his careful examination. Her breathing, though improved from the depths of winter, remained delicate and measured. He placed the stethoscope against her chest, listening intently to the faint, regulated rhythm of her lungs, noting the subtle crackles that still lingered, the slight resistance in each inhalation. "Your lungs have begun to regain their strength," he said softly, removing the instrument and setting it carefully upon the bedside table. "The tonic, the fresh air, and your rest have made a difference. You are not yet cured, but you are stronger than before." Eleanor offered a faint smile, the kind that carried both relief and the lingering fragility of youth tempered by illness. She drew a careful breath, feeling the expansion of her chest, the easing of her cough, and the warmth of her mother's hand resting gently over hers. Mrs. Harbury exhaled slowly, as though the tension of months had found a small release. "We have followed your instructions," she said. "Every tonic, every hour of rest, every window opened and closed with care. We feared that it would not suffice." Yet Dr. Pembroke's gaze softened, though the weight of his profession pressed heavily upon him. "It will suffice if care is continued, but vigilance must not falter. Illness of this kind is patient, relentless, and unforgiving. One lapse, however slight, can undo weeks of progress." He measured Eleanor's pulse, noting the steady, albeit still fragile, rhythm. "This is my final house call," he said gently, almost apologetically. "Not because I abandon my duty, but because your improvement no longer demands daily oversight. Continue your regimen. Continue your care. The home must now serve as the guardian of your health." Eleanor's eyes, faintly bright with hope, met his. "Will you return if—" Dr. Pembroke shook his head. "Only if circumstances demand. You have learned the practices, your family has learned vigilance. That knowledge is now more vital than my presence. Trust it." He packed his instruments slowly, meticulously, as though each motion might carry reassurance into the air itself. The fog outside pressed against the windows, curling around the house like a watchful sentinel. Yet inside, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. There was cautious relief, a fragile hope, and the lingering knowledge that survival now depended not on medicine alone, but on the careful, sustained attentiveness of those who loved the patient. As he stepped back into the street, the winter light glimmered faintly off the frost-covered cobblestones. The city moved on, indifferent, unaware of the victories and struggles occurring behind closed doors. Dr. Pembroke paused briefly, hand on his carriage door, reflecting on the months spent tracing the path of the White Death. The illness was patient, unrelenting, yet here, in this small home, life had endured. With a final nod, he stepped into the carriage, and the wheels began to turn. Behind him, the Harbury household remained silent, vigilant, and hopeful, prepared to continue the battle with every breath Eleanor drew. Across the city and into the halls of Westminster, London felt the weight of its own mortality pressing quietly but insistently upon its streets. The newspapers, usually ablaze with the trivialities of fashion, commerce, and social posturing, carried somber reports of the toll exacted by the White Death. Columns of figures, numbers of the sick, the admitted, the deceased, were printed with a precision that seemed almost cruel in its detachment. Families read the lists with trembling hands, noting names they recognized, streets they walked, and households that had been diminished by a quiet, invisible force. In offices and counting rooms, clerks recorded mortality rates, hospital admissions, and the results of public health inspections. Each number, though impersonal, represented lives carved thin by consumption. The city itself seemed to exhale a slow, mournful breath, as though acknowledging the cumulative weight of its losses. Dr. Lionel Whitcomb stood in his laboratory, observing slides under the microscope, yet even here, the figures pressed upon him. Each patient recorded in the ledgers, each statistic drawn into careful graphs, corresponded to real faces, pale cheeks flushed with fever, hands trembling with weakness, eyes wide with fear. The city's suffering could not be measured merely in data, yet without data there was no path to understanding, and without understanding, no hope of intervention. At the Harbury residence, the toll was felt intimately. Each household, each family, measured loss differently. The empty chair at the breakfast table, the absence of laughter in the corridors, the faint, lingering cough in the rooms of those still struggling. Eleanor, though improving, remained fragile, and each breath she drew was a reminder that survival was never certain. Mrs. Harbury counted each day with vigilance, measuring progress in shallow exhalations, in the faint brightening of cheeks, in the softening of coughs. In the poorer quarters, the reckoning was harsher. Tenements with overcrowded rooms and poor ventilation housed multiple generations beneath a single roof. Workhouses were full, beds crowded, and the sick could not escape one another. Children, too young to understand, watched mothers and fathers fade beneath the persistent coughs. Clerks and shopkeepers tallied absences, marking each name with a quiet grimness, knowing that every loss rippled outward, affecting the fragile balance of family, neighbourhood, and livelihood. Parliament itself grappled with the scale of the calamity. Reports from the sanitary inspector, from hospital administrators, from physicians like Whitcomb, painted a grim picture. Debates over budgets, public health legislation, and sanitary reform carried a sharper edge than usual. The spectre of mortality lent urgency to each word spoken, each proposal offered. Yet still, the debate was constrained by propriety, by hesitation, by the unwillingness to fully confront the human cost behind each statistic. Newspapers carried stories of individual tragedy: the death of a child in a Hampstead Hill sanatorium, the loss of a young factory girl to persistent coughs, the silent passing of a governess whose frail figure betrayed illness before her voice did. Readers felt the weight of each story, yet the scale of loss remained almost incomprehensible. A city's grief tallied in quiet measures, one death at a time. In the streets, fog clung low, muffling the distant clatter of carts and voices. Windows were drawn, shutters closed, and London's citizens moved through their daily tasks with a subdued solemnity. They were aware, in some instinctive way, that the city itself had been diminished, that lives had been quietly excised from the bustling rhythm of commerce, education, and family. And in the quiet, the collective awareness settled across the nation. Numbers in ledgers, names in registers, and faces remembered in private spaces all told the same truth. The White Death had marked London, and a city that prided itself on progress, industry, and civility was forced to reckon with the fragility of its population, the subtle relentlessness of disease, and the measured, devastating calculus of life lost. Each household, each street, each ledger entry bore witness. A nation could quantify its losses, yet could never fully measure the sorrow left behind. The first hints of spring had begun to stretch across London, pale and tentative, lifting the lingering frost from the streets and softening the fog that had clung so stubbornly for months. Along Wellington Row, the gas lamps no longer shivered against dense mist, and shutters were drawn back to allow weak sunlight to spill into homes long shadowed by illness. For the first time in many weeks, the city seemed to inhale a measure of relief, though the air still carried the faint memory of coughs, fevered breaths, and sleepless nights. In the Harbury household, Eleanor lay propped against pillows, her chest rising more freely with each deliberate breath. The flush of fever had faded slightly from her cheeks, and her cough, though still present, had lost some of its insistent harshness. Mrs. Harbury, perched nearby, watched each rise and fall of her daughter's chest with a vigilance born of months spent in quiet dread. Henry hovered at the bedside, too aware of the fragility that surrounded him to play as he once had, yet now permitted himself a faint smile at the improved rhythm of Eleanor's breathing. Dr. Pembroke had returned that morning for a final check, observing the slow recovery with measured attention. "Her lungs are gaining strength," he murmured softly, adjusting the blankets and smoothing damp hair from Eleanor's brow. "The disease has not disappeared, but the progression has slowed. With continued care, she may regain vitality." His voice carried both caution and the faintest glimmer of hope. Outside, London's streets were quieter, yet alive in small, tentative ways. Children, once kept indoors for fear of contagion, began to venture out, their muffled laughter punctuating the soft patter of horse hooves and the distant clatter of market carts. Workhouses reported fewer new cases, and mothers whispered cautiously among themselves about windows opened, better ventilation, and the cautious optimism brought by sunshine and warmth. Across the city, sanatoria recorded improvements, and the pace of admissions began to slow, though the shadow of the White Death remained in quiet corners, patient and watchful. In offices and counting rooms, the latest reports reflected a slow, hard-won progress. Fewer names were added to the ledgers of the sick, fewer deaths recorded in the hospital registers. The Public Health Act, still controversial but increasingly enforced, brought fresh air into tenements, ensured milk was inspected and pasteurized, and prompted reformers to educate households on hygiene and care. Knowledge, once abstract, began to manifest as tangible protection, creating a fragile barrier against the disease that had for so long moved unseen. Within the Harbury home, Eleanor's breaths deepened further, and the once frequent rattle of her lungs quieted. Mrs. Harbury pressed her hand to her daughter's chest, feeling the pulse of life more assured, more rhythmic. "You are breathing more easily," she whispered, a tremor of relief threading through her voice. "You are returning to us." Henry adjusted the vase of early spring blooms on the bedside table, their faint scent mingling with the antiseptic and lavender of the room. They seemed to symbolize the delicate promise of renewal, life reclaiming its place even after the shadow of mortality had pressed so heavily. Dr. Pembroke straightened, surveying the household with cautious satisfaction. "The White Death has begun to fade," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of tempered optimism. "It is not gone, and vigilance remains essential, but life has begun to assert itself once more." Outside, the fog lifted gradually, revealing rooftops and chimneys gleaming faintly in the sunlight. London itself seemed to exhale, the city breathing in tentative relief. For the first time in months, the streets, the homes, and the hearts of its citizens were suffused with the subtle certainty that the relentless grip of tuberculosis had loosened, however, temporarily. Within the Harbury bedroom, Eleanor stirred, her eyes brightening as she drew another measured, steady breath. Mrs. Harbury leaned closer, tears slipping unheeded down her cheeks, and Henry smiled faintly. The weight of fear eased, if only slightly, and in the quiet warmth of the morning, it was clear that though the White Death remained a shadow over London, its relentless march had slowed, and life, fragile, cautious, yet persistent, had begun to reclaim its hold.